welcome to the Better Than We Thought podcast. I am doing this by myself for the first time, so I don't entirely know what I'm doing. Probably not the intro that Ian does, but yeah, welcome to the podcast. I'm trying to remember what he normally says because he always does the start, and I don't really remember, which is bad because I've heard it like 50 times. But anyway, today we have an amazing guest on, Lexie. Lexie, tell me a little bit about yourself. And, well, first of all, let me tell everybody how I know you. So, I was a girls' dean like 6 years ago, I think. And Lexie was one of my students. You were student association president, weren't you?
Vice president, I think.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Anyway, super awesome person who I haven't seen in way too long, so I'm really excited to see you on here today. And super excited for you to share your story of just what God's been doing in your life over this last little bit. But why don't you start off with just telling me a little bit about who you are, where you live?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I'm being too official of an interviewer, but I don't know.
No, you're good. Well, I'm Lexie. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I'm currently a traveling registered nurse. I actually work in Lexington, Kentucky, so
okay. Ian
I feel like
has
it's not really a travel, but yeah, I just go to work on the days I'm supposed to work, and then I come home on my days off. It's kind of a nice gig because it's not far from Knoxville.
Okay.
But I feel like part of understanding my testimony is understanding my background. So are you okay if I give a little overview?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, so to keep it short and sweet, because there's so many details I could include, I am the third of 4 children. Growing up, I was raised by mostly a single mother. I was a 7th generation Adventist.
I did not know that part. Oh my gosh.
7 whole generations.
Wow.
Born and raised. I grew up in Hagerstown, Maryland. That's where I spent roughly, I would say, 8 years of my life. And then I grew up in an Adventist community, literally did not know that anyone else in the world was an Adventist. I went to
Funny
Adventist
point.
school.
I've been to the Hagerstown, Maryland Adventist Church when I was 8. I don't know if you were there, but that would have been really funny if you were.
That would have been. Yeah, I went there. I went to Mount Etna Adventist Elementary School. I grew up in it's a small mountain community. And then I moved to Southern Maryland when my mom got married, and went to public school and did that from 8 to 12, I think. And then there was some stuff that happened in our family, and we moved to Tennessee, lived with my grandmother, and I went back to Adventist school. So I've been out of it for a while, and I actually didn't want to go back. But the public school system in the area, the school system we wanted to get into didn't have any slots for us. And so we went to go check out the one that we were assigned to based off of where we lived. And we went in, and there was nobody there. It was a snow day, but the door was unlocked. So we go inside, and it's the county middle school, and the lockers are beat up, and it smells like weed. And my mom was like, this is not happening.
Yeah, no, this is not it.
She was like, the only other option I could think of is sending you back to Adventist school. I moved to Greenville, Tennessee. It's a small town in Tennessee, and there is an Adventist community there. And it ended up working out that the Adventist church that my grandmother went to, that we became a part of, paid for our education. So I went back to Adventist school in 7th grade, and I stayed through my college experience. I do want to make a disclaimer here for everything we're about to talk about. I am grateful for everything I've experienced in life, and a majority of that was within the Adventist community. It brought me some of my closest friends. I think that there were beautiful things that God used throughout that. It's definitely part of my story for a reason. So anything I say that may be negative isn't on the beautiful things I experienced within it. It's not just
that's
black
really
and white.
cool. You can see that. That's really cool.
Yeah,
You can see that too, because I
yeah,
think a lot of times people think that like people only leave because like they hate it or they had a bad experience. But there are people who leave not because they had a bad experience, but because they realize like maybe it's not biblical.
yeah.
So yeah, I
I
think
think it
that's
was
really
a
cool.
little bit of both for sure,
I'm
but
sure. Yeah.
overall, like I did have like I knew it was a part of my life for a reason, especially looking back.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, so I ended up meeting you at an academy that we shall not name.
That's probably a good idea. If we do name it, my dad will bleep it out. That's probably smart.
And that was my senior year. So I remember seeing you and thinking, oh my gosh, she looks close to our age. And at first, like we were both kind of reserved. I remember asking you after like the ice had broken, like what you heard about me, and you were like, I heard that you were just like really sure of yourself and like really like confident. And I was like, what does that mean? And you
I was
were
kind
like,
of scared of you, honestly, because I had heard like so many like she's a powerhouse, and like I was probably only like 4 years. Well, how old are you?
yeah, I was 8. I was 17, and I think you turned 22 my senior year. So
Okay,
there
so
was
I was
like
like 5 years
four or
older.
five
That's not
years.
that
Yeah.
much.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, and you
So
were like super like more extroverted, confident kind of personality, and I was like, oh man.
no, no, and it didn't take long for like the ice to
No.
break, and for like that year at the academy was probably the worst out of my two, but my dorm life was the best. Like that
Oh.
was, I'll always cherish that, and the memories we have with you, and like you definitely made a very large impact in my life that year. Um,
Aw.
and I'll never forget that. And I'm grateful. Like, and I like the way that this timeline of things I'm about to share. Like, there's a reason. Like, you came to
Mm.
Heritage, and if it wasn't just for all the other
Mm.
lives you touched, it was part of my story,
Oh
for
my
sure. Like,
gosh.
there's no coincidence about it.
Aw.
So, did I just say
That's
the name? I did.
crazy. It's okay,
Anyway.
bleep. I still
Whoops.
remember that night with you and Allison and Shoshana when you guys had a sleepover in my house and you were up until like, well, we can say this now because the other students didn't know this at the time, but I had so many nights of doing this with, in some way, shape, or form with so many different people. But you guys were in my house until like 2 a.m. showing me old
Yeah.
pictures of you guys in middle school. It was so fun.
Yeah, that was a good time. But yeah, I remember specifically too, like that. So this is important too to like touch on for me is during that time, you only exemplified the character of Christ, and I felt
Mm.
it was so genuine, especially compared to certain experiences that I had had at the academy. And one of
Yeah.
those things that really intrigued me was you had all your prayer journals that you had printed out. And I don't know if you remember, but me and Allison were
Oh,
like
I
sitting on the
do.
floor. Yeah, and we were like going through them, and I was like, I've never seen like a display of like communication with God in this way. And it really
Mm.
inspired me to the point where like I started doing that. I don't do it as actively anymore,
That's
but
so
for a
cool.
long period of
Neither do
time, like
I.
that
Yeah.
became like my form of communicating with God. And I just remember reading some of the things you said and knowing like her heart is like with the Lord. Like she is driven by
Mm.
God. And that plays a role for sure into this
That's
entire
so cool.
entire
Those were
experience.
such
But
old prayer journals. I remember you being like, "Can I look at these?" I was like, "Yeah, I don't care. These are so old. None of this is even remotely relevant anymore." As
yeah.
opposed to, I don't know if you ever knew this, but did you know that people in the dorm snuck into my house and stole my current prayer journal and distributed it around the dorm, the one I was
That's
writing currently?
horrible.
And then
I don't think
I
I was
wrote
there for
something.
that.
No, it was probably the year after you left.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
and
my
it was being
gosh.
distributed around the dorm, and I didn't find out for months until I had written something before break about how exhausted I was and how excited I was for break, and one of the
Yeah.
kids told her mom and said, "Miss Hannah doesn't like us. She hates us. She wrote it in her journal." I was like, "That's not what I wrote." And the mom called me and told
Oh,
me that they were all reading my journal, and I was like, "What?"
that's
So yeah. I
crazy.
learned after that I bought a journal with a lock on it, and that was
Oh
my
yeah.
journal.
Yeah. Oh
But
my gosh.
that's so cool that that little moment was something that actually had an impact. That's really cool.
Oh yeah, for sure. And there's so many more that I could go into, and some that may come up as we talk. But essentially, after high school, I went to in Adventist University. I went through the nursing program, which I have no regrets about. The nursing program was incredible. Some of my closest friends to this day, who actually play a role into the story, were in the nursing program, were at Southern,
Yeah.
and I felt like I got a really good education. I had really good professors.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout my entire life, I don't think up until recently, I never really truly questioned Adventism. I
Yeah.
always felt like it was the truth and that there were certain things that didn't add up, but like I knew the character of God, and so like I could be my own kind of Adventist, and so like that
Yeah.
was kind of the environment I was raised in. So even like going through Southern, which compared to where I went to Academy, Southern was like Freedom Central. So
Literally.
I don't know what y'all are complaining about because this is fine.
I know.
But yeah, so then I graduated with my associate's degree in
Mm-hmm.
2022, and I moved to Lexington, Kentucky, actually to be a staff
Oh,
nurse
okay.
at the University of Kentucky. My sister and her
Okay.
husband were travel nurses there, and still are. But at the time,
Mm-hmm.
they had they were living there as they were traveling, and I wanted a support system, and I also wanted to start at a really good hospital, and it's incredible compared to hospitals in Tennessee. So I moved
Mm.
there and I started night shift. And for 2 years, 2 solid years after graduating,
Wow.
I had not gone to church. It wasn't necessarily an active choice. I mean, I guess some could
Yeah.
argue it was, but number one, I worked a lot of weekends, and I was night shift. So
Yeah.
even if I didn't work
Oh man, you're
like the weekends,
exhausted.
I was just dead. And number two,
Yeah.
I didn't really form community within where I was working. The people I worked with weren't
Mm-hmm.
people I would necessarily, besides one of them, weren't people I would necessarily hang out with outside of work. The environment I was working in was very toxic, and I just really didn't have any friendships. I wanted
Yeah.
community, but I didn't necessarily. I was also getting my bachelor's degree full time online, as well as working full time and overtime. So I kind of like burnt
That's a
myself out.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so during that period, like I've always, my mother raised me, and I'm so thankful for this throughout all of this, to have a relationship with Jesus first and foremost. And she exemplified
Yeah.
that for me. And so I really held on to the fact that I knew Jesus and he knew me. And um, so I would basically, like, my form of worship was listening to worship music and then like just talking to God like throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just kind of second nature to me to do that.
Yeah.
So I didn't necessarily feel like I was far from God. Um, and it wasn't really hitting me that like I had missed church until I moved to Knoxville. So after my first year as a nurse, I knew I was going to go back to Tennessee. I wanted to go back
Mm-hmm.
to home. So I moved to Knoxville, and funny enough, my sister and her husband bought property here, so they live here too. And
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah, so it's really nice. And I started working as a home health hospice nurse because I did not want to work in
Mm.
the hospitals here. And I loved hospice care. I hated my job. I don't know how to like explain that other than it was corporate, surprisingly, and I hated that.
Oh, interesting.
And I didn't have there wasn't like an off switch. Like at the hospital, you clock in, you clock out. There was no clocking in,
Yeah.
clocking out. They had the patients and
Wow.
their family members had my personal phone number,
Oh
so
my
they could like
gosh.
contact me whenever, and I would, even when I made it clear, like after 5 p.m. you need to contact the on-call number, they still contacted me, which they felt comfortable with me, and so I understood that. But it got to a place where I felt guilty if I didn't answer, or
Yeah.
it was just kind of messing with me. And then um, I'm very empathetic, and so while I did
Mm-hmm.
love being there for those people at the worst moment of their lives, it also hurt me a lot when I couldn't get the patients to a
Yeah.
place where they were visibly comfortable as they were actively dying,
Oh,
because that
yeah.
happens sometimes. Like you could put them on all
Yeah.
the medications possible, and they were suffering, and it was you couldn't hide it, and that would eat at me alive. Like I could not
Oh,
sleep.
it's
I would have
so
dreams
hard.
about it. Yeah. So, and not only that, but I was not making enough money at all for
Mm.
the cost of
Yeah.
living. So it was 6 months in, was like, all right, well, I don't want to do this anymore, but I don't want to work in the hospitals here, and I
Yeah.
need something that's going to pay me what the cost of living is. So I was like, well, at that point, I've been a nurse for a year and a half, and I was like, well, I can go back and I guess travel nurse, but I want to go back to University of Kentucky because I trust that they're safe. I know that they have
Yeah.
some safe nurse to patient ratios. At the time, my brother-in-law was still a travel nurse there, And I asked
Mm.
him, I was like, hey, could you talk to your manager and see if there's a spot open? Because the caveat was University of Kentucky will only accept a travel nurse if they've had 2 solid years of bedside experience. So I had a year and
Oh,
a half.
wow.
So,
Oh, dang.
right. So I texted him. I'd already gotten a travel nurse recruiter, and they were trying to see if we could get that worked out. And it ended up there wasn't any spots. And this was in
Mm.
October of 2023.
Okay.
And so I was like, you know what? I don't know if I can handle this job much longer. Like every day I was waking up and just like rolling my eyes that I had to go to work. Like it was like
Yeah.
affecting my life in the worst way. And so I was like, you know what? The University of Kentucky made me a great nurse. I trust my clinical skills. I trust my judgment. I'll take a contract somewhere else in Kentucky because it's safer than Tennessee for the most part. And
Mm-hmm.
when a spot opens up, I'll go back to UK. So I took a offer, and in retrospect, I shouldn't have because they literally, I sent my application. An hour later, my recruiter called me and said they offered you the position. I didn't speak to a manager. I didn't talk to anyone, and that happens sometimes with like travel nursing.
Okay.
But University of Kentucky would never do that. So it just kind of shows
Yeah.
you like the standard of which the hospital works. Um, but
Yeah.
I signed a contract for a hospital in Bowling Green, and this is where my story kind of starts.
Mm.
If you want to interrupt at like any point to ask me
You're doing
questions,
great.
like go ahead. But yeah, so I took this contract and it didn't start until November. So it started November 19th. And I went there all by myself, didn't know anyone. I was staying at this lady's house who was renting out a room, and she worked at the hospital actually as a surgical tech. Um,
Mm.
and my first week there was mostly just like orientation, getting paperwork done. I didn't actually go on the floor until later on in the week. So I had gotten to come home before I started my first night on the floor, and that because
Mm-hmm.
it was Thanksgiving. So I came home and
Oh.
I really felt like just the way that everything worked out. And in retrospect, I don't necessarily know if I would feel this way now, but I felt like, oh, like this is totally God, like everything's working
Mm.
together. I met the manager, she was so nice. I was told the unit was just like the unit I had worked on as a new grad. I worked on a cardiac ICU step down unit, and I was
Mm-hmm.
told it was the same deal. Um, and I was going to get the schedule I wanted. And so I was just like really excited about it. And
Yeah.
my first night that I started there, it was a completely different world. I was like, oh my gosh, how does this
Oh
place
man.
function? You
Oh
get
my
2 nights
gosh.
of, yeah, you get 2 nights of orientation as a travel nurse. And
Mm.
you're just expected to like be thrown to the wolves, I guess. And the thing about nursing is like the job is the same no matter where you go. It's
Yeah.
the processes like that involve like who you contact for certain things, like for a material that you might need or a machine that you might
Okay.
need, or
Yeah.
how do you contact the doctors? How do they set that up? What is the culture of the hospital? What is expected of you to do without contacting the doctor that's within your scope of practice, according to what the
Mm-hmm.
hospital wants. And so all of those nuances are anywhere you go are like hard to figure out. But in an
Yeah.
environment where it's just not safe in general, it makes everything harder. So
Yeah.
for reference, at University of Kentucky, the most patients I would take on an ICU step down unit, which I was on the same type of unit,
Mm-hmm.
was 4 patients, and that was
Mm-hmm.
on a bad day, and those 4 patients
Yeah.
were not bad. 3 patients were typically a little bit more sick. You had to watch a little bit more with what was going on. On the unit
Mm-hmm.
I was on, it was considered a pulmonary COVID ICU step down unit. I typically had 5 patients, and the
Dang.
systems in place for this hospital were very archaic. So they didn't have any
Mm.
kind of cohesive environment to contact doctors or to, it was all pager based. And not only that, but finding the information for contacting a doctor was like the most impossible thing, to the point where nurses that had been
Mm.
there for 2 or 3 years were like, I don't know how to teach you this because it's hard. Like, it's not easy to figure out who's on call. Yeah. So, and the culture
Wow.
of the hospital was do not contact the doctor unless your patient is knocking on death's door. So that made me feel like I couldn't do things for my patients that I needed to do. And not only that, but like if an emergency was happening and I need to get a
You don't
hold
know
of the
what to
doctor,
do.
I don't have time to spend 5 minutes trying to figure out
Mm-mm.
who the doctor is.
Yeah.
And not only that, but just like the lack of resources, um, the ratios, it all just all set up this perfect storm
Mm.
for things to be very unsafe. So that
Yeah.
started getting at me to the point where one of my things as a nurse is like I want to take care of my patients as if they're my mom or my brother or my sister, and I
Yeah.
take very much pride in that. I've held on to that throughout this. It's been
Yeah.
2.5, almost 3 years now that I've been a nurse.
Well, that's
Um,
hard.
and so in that environment, like my patients were sitting in their own feces for hours because I didn't have the time to adequately check on them and clean them up. And so things like that were
Wow.
eating at me alive, but also there were some sick ones that I just couldn't be in the room at all times. So by the time I came to see them, they were worse off because I didn't catch it because I didn't have the time to catch it. And so the feelings
Yeah.
of like these patients are getting really poor patient outcomes because of the situation I'm in and the fact that number one, their lives are at risk. Number two, I could lose my nursing license and I can't function in this environment.
Yeah.
So I started having panic attacks at work. And I'd never had panic attacks before. I've experienced
Mm.
anxiety. I've been medicated for it before. I was medicated for it, but had been off of the medication because when I moved, I had not set up a primary care because I didn't have time because I was working 5 days a
Mm-hmm.
week. And I was
Oh
doing
my
okay. So
gosh.
I was like, well, I'll be
Yeah, it's
fine.
like,
And then I went
yeah.
back into this environment that like triggered my anxiety. And I was literally at work, not able to think. Like, having to
Mm.
control my breathing. The second night I was there, I got called off because they had too many nurses, but then they called me back in, sent me to a different unit, which you can get sent to different units. It was around 11 p.m. and I got there. It was me and another nurse. There was 8 beds in the unit, and when I walked in, she looked at me and said, "You look so scared. I'm gonna laugh my butt off at you all night long." That was my yeah. So that was just like a little bit of the culture there. So I was
Oh my
like,
gosh,
oh.
that's bad.
And then at one point during that night, it was like right about to be shift change. So it was around like 6 in the morning. And I
Mm-hmm.
had a lot to do still. I still hadn't looked through my patient's charts. I didn't really know anything about them. And I wanted to be able to give the nurse coming on an idea of what was going on. I had no idea what was going on. So I was like, hey, could you go give this medication for room 7? And she's scrolling on her phone, like on TikTok. And she's like, you have an hour. Don't ask me for help. I was like, okay. So like it took everything in me not to cry, and I was like, all right. So
Oh my
I
gosh.
so yeah, so I did 3 weeks there, and by the end of those 3 weeks, my mental health was so bad that when I was home, even when I was home, because I would come home for my days off, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was dreaming about it.
Yeah.
I got to a place where I literally had thoughts of I didn't want to wake up. Like that's all I kept thinking. I
Mm.
don't want to wake up. It was the first time in my life that I've been genuinely like having like suicidal thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really scary place. And I also felt ashamed because I was like, why is this making me feel this way? Like nurses go
Mm.
through these conditions every day. This isn't new. Like I can't handle it. I'm not a good nurse. Why did I choose this career? It was just
Mm.
such a dark place. And it sounds like
Yeah.
silly at the surface, but I also felt trapped
No,
because,
that sounds traumatic, honestly. I mean, that
yeah.
is a type of trauma, dealing with life or death every day and not being able to do anything about it. Like,
Yeah, I guess so. I think I just really am hard on myself too, knowing like that
yeah.
it's something people deal with and they do it. And but the thing is, I knew how it should be, so I couldn't
Yeah.
be in the environment that was just
No.
not conducive to
Mm-mm.
doing things good. So um, and it ended up like I was going back and forth, like I quit this job? I can't quit this job. I can't afford to quit this job. I don't want to go
Mm.
back to hospice. I don't want to work in the hospitals in Tennessee because it'll be the same thing just with less pay.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt trapped, and I think that played a large role in my feelings
Yeah.
of just not wanting to exist
Totally.
anymore. Um, and so during those 3 weeks, at some point, I ended up setting a primary care appointment up. And it was a week after I set it up. So I'd finished, well, I didn't know it was going to be my last week, but I did. I worked 6 shifts straight so that I can be off for 8 days, which is hard, but it's worth it. So I was home for my 8 day stretch, and during this time, my sister was off for maternity leave, and we're very, very close. She's 6 years older than me, and she's a nurse. And every day after work, I pretty much called her crying on FaceTime, and we just kept going back and forth of like, well, you're just getting used to things. And for me, I felt like if I understood the systems, I would be more efficient and it wouldn't be as hard. So that's what I would
Yeah.
tell myself, like, well, I just need to get used to the systems. And so we would
Mm.
kind of like talk me in circles of like, well, just keep going, just keep going. And my brother-in-law, I love him to death. They've been married for 10 years. I've known him since I was 12. Um,
Oh, he's like your brother at
he
this point.
he's basically like my dad. I mean,
Yeah.
he's played the father role in my life.
Aw.
he saw me one day. It was like 2 days before I ended up quitting, and I was in such a dark place. I felt like I couldn't be alone, and I was like
Mm.
scared to be alone. And so my
Yeah.
boyfriend goes to University of Tennessee, and I was spending time with him, and I was at his apartment, but he was going home for Christmas break. And I was like, and I was spending like every day with him. Like I saw him every day.
Mm-hmm.
He helped ease some of the anxiety I couldn't handle on my own. And
Yeah.
so I was saying goodbye to him, and I like had a panic attack and like broke down and like sobbing,
Mm.
couldn't breathe, and he was trying to like
Mm.
console me. And I called my sister, and I was like, "Where are you guys? Like, I just need to be with you." And they were at my niece's jujitsu class. So I show up to this jujitsu class, and I walk in, and I know this now. I didn't know this at the time, but I walk in, and my brother-in-law sees me, and he had said to my sister, like, "I have never seen her like this. She needs to quit that job."
Oh
And
my
so
gosh.
I walk in, and I'm talking to my sister, and I start like crying intermittently, and I'm like, I just don't know what to do. And she's like, I don't know, like, and she starts crying because I'm crying, and I'm trying to like
Yeah.
keep it together because my niece is there, and there's like a bunch of
Yeah.
kids. And
Oh.
so I ended up spending that evening with them, and the next day we had made plans to go to Dollywood to see like a Christmas light.
Mm-hmm.
And that day, I mustered up some kind of motivation to go to the gym with my sister. And while we're at the gym, I was in good spirits, and I kind of had this like, I guess the endorphins of working out. I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
convinced myself like it's gonna be okay. I can do this. I'll give it 2 more weeks, and if it's
Mm.
not better in 2 weeks, And then I went home, and I was alone, and I was showering before I was gonna go meet them to go to Dollywood, and everything came crashing down. Like all of the
Mm.
fear, all of the anxiety, all of the. Sorry, my dog's barking.
You're good.
Trying to make sure she's not going to keep going. Okay. All of the fear and
Mm-hmm.
anxiety I was feeling just like hit me like a ton of bricks, and I just like started having another panic attack. I
Mm.
took a shower. I went over to my sister's, and I remember this so distinctly because it was just a picture of how dark everything felt for me. I walked up the
Mm.
stairs in her house, and at the time, her second daughter, she was about 6 months old, and she was bathing her, and I was in the bathroom
Mm-hmm.
with her, and I remember seeing them and just like thinking, I'm never gonna have that, like, because I
Mm. Oh
couldn't
my
see anything, like
gosh.
I just felt like
Yeah, the
that's
future.
not happening for me because I can't figure something out. Like everything is black. Like that's how everything felt. It just felt
Mm.
black.
Yeah.
And so I started sobbing at that. And then she's like, "What's wrong?" And I told her. And then we get in the car to go to Dollywood. And at this point, I hadn't spoken to my brother-in-law. His name's Lorenzo. I hadn't spoken to him about
Uh-huh.
how I was feeling. I knew that he knew. My sister had told him, but she
Mm-hmm.
sat in the back with the kids, and I sat up front with him. And the whole way there, um, I was just looking out the window and like intermittently crying. And I love Dollywood. Dollywood's a place that I love to go to. I'm never sad
Yeah.
there. And we get into the parking lot, and my brother-in-law parks the car. He turns and looks at me and says, "Lex, you need to come home. Quit that job." And I just start sobbing because for some reason that did it for me. I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
okay." Like,
Yeah.
and I
Somebody
think
sees
that
that this is legit.
yeah, and I think too, like because I really do look to him as like a father figure. So like the
Mm-hmm.
authority and like his decision of like
Yeah.
he validated like this isn't just me being in my head. I'm not just overreacting. And
Yeah.
he went on to say like this is not worth your life. No job is worth your
Yeah.
life. It doesn't matter if somebody else could do it. You can't, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
so he was like, we'll figure it out. Like, we'll help you. And luckily, during the period that I quit the job, they were able to financially assist me. And I ended
Mm.
up paying them back. But I was so grateful for that. And so we go into Dollywood, and I was still kind of talking in circles. And he was like, Lexie, it doesn't matter. Like, quit. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay. So I texted my recruiter, and I was like, so I'm still in Dollywood, like crying. I'm just like, how am I crying? And this is Dollywood. The Christmas lights are out. Like,
Your niece is probably
yeah,
like, what is
yeah.
happening?
I tried my best to hide it from her. I think that she was kind of in her own little world.
Yeah, fair.
The oldest is 5, so she's just like enjoying her life, eating her cotton
Yeah.
candy. But yeah, so I just texted my recruiter and I said, "Hey, I'm so sorry." And this is on a Wednesday, or no, this is on a Tuesday. I was supposed to go back to work on Thursday. Okay, so I texted her Tuesday
Oh
night.
man.
Yeah, and Wednesday was my appointment to get back on my anxiety medication. So I texted her Tuesday
Mm.
night and I'm like, "Hey, I'm so sorry, but I cannot finish this contract. I can't do a 2-week notice." And she had already knew that I was struggling because I had let her know. I was like, but it's just not a safe environment. I don't
Mm-mm.
feel like I can safely take care of patients. Actually, at that point, I hadn't told her that. I just said, I told her I would do a 2 week notice. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I'll do a 2 week notice, but that's it. I just can't do it. It's just not for me.
Yeah.
And she had told me, that's okay. Like, call me tomorrow. I want to see what's going on, see if we can fix this. And I was like, okay. So I knew that we weren't going to fix it because I wasn't going to do anything
Yeah.
to keep putting myself in that situation. But I had
Yeah.
agreed to do the 2 weeks. I felt like financially it was my only option because otherwise, like, I wouldn't get paychecks, and I needed a bumper between figuring out, like, quitting and figuring out what I was
Right.
going to do. And so that night we went out to eat, and Lorenzo was like, "You don't have to do the 2 weeks." I was like, "But I do." He's like, "But you don't." So then the next morning I wake up and I feel even more fearful than I ever have because I had to go back to work the next day.
Mm.
And I had called my boyfriend. I was like, I don't think I can do this. And he was like, then
Yeah.
don't. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay. I was like, all right. So I went to my
Yeah.
appointment to get my anxiety medication, and my brother-in-law happened to be there because it was his same primary care. And I was sitting in the waiting
Mm.
room, and I looked like the life had been sucked out of me, and I was like, Lorenzo, I don't think I can do the 2 weeks. He's like, okay, that's fine. He's like, well, we got you. Like, we'll take care of you, whatever you need. I went to my appointment. They did the anxiety and depression screening, and I scored super high and started like
Yeah.
sobbing while she was asking me the questions. And she was like, and she was a nurse practitioner, so she was like, yeah, no, like this isn't worth your
Yeah, this
life.
is not good. No.
Um, so I got started back on my medication that day, and I had thought that if I quit, I would feel so much better. That's not what happened.
Mm.
There was a
Mm.
weight that like was lifted for sure, but the damage that was done, I keep pointing because I felt it all in my heart. It wasn't, I know it was in my brain, but I felt it all in my heart.
Well,
The
it really
damage that
was
was
trauma. Like that
done,
doesn't just go away. Yeah.
yeah. So, whoops, hit my table. It was just it was deep, and I didn't realize how deep it
Yeah.
was. And so at the time, like while we were at Dollywood, was applying to all these random jobs because I'm a type A plant. Like I have plan A, B, and C. Like I don't do
Yeah.
things without a plan.
I know.
So I was just like, what is going? Like how do I grasp with the fact that I don't have something else set up? And I was just applying to jobs I didn't even want because I just like needed to be proactive.
Yeah.
And so like then over time I was reflecting, and at this point I was still so damaged that like I didn't feel like I could be alone. So I was living with my sister, even though I lived 10 minutes away from
Mm.
her. I stayed at her house, and I'm so glad that she was on maternity leave because I don't know what I would have done without her. But I was spending
Mm.
every day with her, and I kind of got to a point where I was like, I don't want to do any of this. Why am I a nurse? Like, I just want to do
Mm.
a job that doesn't involve people's lives. There's a Buc-ee's in Sevierville that was hiring 35 an hour for general managers. I was like, I'll just go work at the gas station. Like, like what's going on? Like,
Yeah. It's like your quarter life
and
crisis.
yeah, for real. I genuinely, and I felt like I was such an awful nurse. Like I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the brains,
Mm.
I didn't like. How could I ever be trusted to take care of anyone? Like I just had convinced
Sounds like you
myself
just
that.
had empathy and not everybody else did.
I mean, yeah, one of the nurses told me that I needed to get over feeling like these people were my loved ones because I just couldn't do that in that environment. And not that she was kind of right. I mean, to survive, that's true, but that's not what I
Right,
wanted
but
to contribute to.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so ended up where I had my brother-in-law was like, well, what if I text the manager again? Because at this point it's December. Okay, so this had started in October, ended in December, and he was like, let me text her, and I was like, okay. So he texted her, and I had to go back to Bowling Green like the day after I quit because I had something that was the hospital's property, like it was like a location badge that they had given me, that I
Mm.
needed to return to them, and I also had things at the place I was staying. So I ended up having to go alone, but my mom was on the phone with me the entire time. Like I had my AirPods
Mm.
in when I walked into the hospital, and I knew that my brother-in-law was reaching out to his manager. And so I get to the hospital to drop off whatever the location thing that they had. I put it at the nurse's station. The manager wasn't in, and I was trying to go like unseen. And I had only been there for 3 weeks, but like I knew some people, like I knew the day shift
Yeah.
nurses. And so one of the day shift nurses that knew I was struggling she saw me like as I was walking away, and she was like, "Is that Lexie?" And I was like, and I wasn't wearing scrubs, like I was in normal people clothes, and I was like,
Yeah.
"Yeah." She was like, "Are you leaving?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she was like, "I'm so sorry." I was like, "It's
Aw.
okay." But I just didn't like want to talk to anyone, and so then I get to
Yeah.
the elevator, and as soon as I get to the elevator, I get a screenshot of a text message with my brother-in-law and the manager, and she said, "This is like the timing is incredible." She said, "I would love to speak to your sister. I'm gonna hold the spot for her. I can't talk to her until a certain amount of time until the spot opens, but we have a spot opening at the end of January, and let her know like I will be speaking to her." And that was as
And
soon as I
this
got
is
to the
at
elevator.
the University of
Of
Lexington.
Kentucky, yeah, in
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Lexington.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
because at
my
that point,
gosh.
that point still, I'd only been a nurse for a year and a half, so the only way I could get into UK was through the manager. And at that point, I was like, I had chills like go up and down my body, and I was like, oh my gosh, like that is the timing. Like I was at the elevator, and that's when I got the text. And
That's crazy.
my mom was like, that gives me like chills too. And but even though I had got that text, because it wasn't set in stone, I still was like very anxious about everything.
Yeah.
Um, so I drove home. That was, I would say, like the second week of December. And I wanted to talk to the manager like myself. So I texted her, I think the next week, and just to clarify, like, I want you to know I'm
Mhm.
very interested in this opportunity. Like,
Mhm.
just kept like making sure that that was still, we were on the same page about that. And she was like, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I will let you know like when I can interview you, and I'll talk to the travel agency. And I had told
Mhm.
my recruiter, so they were working on it. But for some reason, there's like certain logistics, because I was taking somebody else's spot who was leaving at the end of January. So there
Got
was
it.
like
Yeah.
logistics behind when she was able to like officially offer me the job. I don't really know
Makes
what those
sense.
were,
Yeah.
but anyway, so throughout that period, I definitely felt a little bit more hope, because taking that job, not only would I be with my sister and her husband on the same unit, we would work the same schedule,
Mm.
but the financial burden I was carrying would be taken care of. And I knew I'd be in a safe environment providing
Yeah.
care that I love to provide. So it all kind of felt too
Yeah.
good to be true, to the point where like Satan had convinced me so much that I was garbage that I was like, why would God give that to me?
Mm.
Like, why would God give
Wow.
me this gift?
Yeah.
And at that time too, like I felt like I was in such a dark place that I couldn't even feel the presence of God. And I knew that He was there, and I didn't think He abandoned me. But I remember distinctly like these worship songs that would always like bring chills to me, and I would sob, didn't do anything. And almost kind of
Mm.
annoyed me too, which I was like, that's not like
Mm.
me. That's not
Yeah.
from me. And I even so knew that God was orchestrating all of these things. Like I had enough, I guess, knowledge of my character of God, my relationship with
Mhm.
God, to know like
Yeah.
none of those dark feelings were from Him, and that He was
Right.
in the background doing everything. So I held
Mhm.
on to that, but I wasn't necessarily like actively doing the things I would do in my normal life as far as my relationship with
Yeah.
God. Um, but I just remember distinctly like feeling that separation, and it was a scary feeling
Mhm.
because I was like, where is this coming from? Um, but let's see, where am I going with this? So during that time period, this also plays into the role of like just God's timing and like the miracles He worked in
Mm.
my life.
Yeah.
So right before I quit, I think it was like the day of my last shift, I was driving to work, and
Mhm.
I would drive to work 30 minutes before I had to be there so I could sit in the parking lot, because I would have panic attacks before work, and I just wanted to like try to regulate myself. So I'm in the car, I'm about to get to the parking lot, and I got a call from someone. I don't think he worked at the academy when you were there, but he was the canvassing leader of the academy my junior year.
Oh, I know
And
who he is.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so we're good friends. We stayed in touch afterwards. We'd talk occasionally when I was at Southern. He was there, and I'd see him, run into him. And I've always like felt like we've had a good relationship, but we
Mhm.
hadn't talked in a long time, and his like name popped up, and I was like, he probably like meant to call someone else, because I was on the phone with my boyfriend trying to like figure out how to regulate myself.
Mhm.
And so I just like let it go to voicemail, and then he called me
Yeah.
again, and I was like, maybe he meant to call me. So I answered the phone, and he's starting to talk, and I could tell he had called the wrong Lexie. I was like, hey Sam, like so good to hear from you, but you've called the wrong Lexie. And he's like, oh. I was like, yeah. He's like, well, how are you? And I was like, honestly, not too good. And I kind of gave him like a short rundown, but I told him, I was
Yeah.
like, I am having like these panic attacks. It doesn't feel safe. I don't really know what to do. And he was like, well, I think there's a reason I
Mm.
have called the wrong Lexie. Let's pray together. I was like, okay.
Mm.
So he prays for me, and he was like, I'm gonna check in on you in a couple weeks. I was like, okay. So
Mm.
the wildness of this all. So that happened the day before I quit. I get the contract for my position from the travel
Yeah.
company stating like how much I was going to get paid. It had the manager's approval. I got that contract
Wow.
on January 6th, I want to say. And literally
Mm.
right after I signed and submitted this contract, I get a text from him and he said, "How are you?" Like
That's
literally
wild.
right after I signed the contract. And I was like, "You'll never believe the timing of what just happened." And I
Yeah.
told him, he was like, "Oh my gosh." I was like, it just like, so there was just like those little moments where like God was still reminding me, like, I know you can't feel me like you used to, but I'm here
But I'm
and
still
I'm
here.
working
Yeah.
through all of this. And looking back now, I know that that was the catalyst for this entire journey for me. So I wouldn't change
Mm.
it because of that. It made God so tangible to me in a way I hadn't felt him in a long
Mm.
time. And just reminded me of his power and his miracles and like his love for me. And that definitely shaped me for, it's always going to be a part of who I am. And it took me from December, I would say, to like July to heal all of that.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a part of my story. And so that all happened from November through January. I started
Wow.
at the University of Kentucky, I think February 1st, so a year ago.
Oh.
And I took me a while actually. I think I definitely had post traumatic stress disorder because when I walked
I
into the
was gonna say, yeah.
hospital, I literally like was having feelings of anxiety
Yeah.
and panic attacks, and I had to remind myself like I'm safe. I'm in a safe environment. There's safe resources. My sister's literally right here. Like I had
Yeah.
to remind myself of that. It took probably a month for that to go away.
Wow.
But I started getting in a groove, and I remember having the moment where I was like, I am totally meant to be a nurse. And it was, I had a patient.
Aw.
She was in the ICU and she had come back down to our floor because she wasn't quite stable enough to go to a regular floor or go home. And
Mhm.
she had not had a shower in over a month. She'd been in the hospital for over a
Mm.
month and she couldn't really walk. She hadn't walked since she'd been in the hospital, but me and two other nurses somehow got her into a chair and got her into the shower. And she got to wash her
Mhm.
hair and like wash her body. And
Aw.
I helped her brush her teeth. And I remember when she got back in bed, she was like, "You have no idea how much that meant to me." And I was just like, this is why I
Aw.
became a nurse because these are the things I couldn't
Yeah.
do in Bowling Green. I could have never done that.
Right. No
And
time.
like I get to do this here and it's just so fulfilling and like it's I honestly love that part of my job more than I love like the medications and the like
Mhm.
providing the
Right. It's more
care is like
rewarding.
my
Yeah.
favorite part.
Mhm.
And so like ever since then I had been building up my confidence in my nursing and not only that but just like the amount of patients that like stories of where God gave me this patient and they just like shine this beautiful light and to like remind me of why I'm doing this and why I'm in this
Mm.
career and just shine the light on like every single way that he worked. And I have to think too,
Mm.
so another big part of why that background is a huge part of the story is
Mhm.
because in March, so that's where my journey out of Adventism starts, I would say. It was a
Mhm.
slow burn at first, but in March I had a patient and she was in her 90s. She was
Mhm.
comatose. She had had a
Mm.
stroke and she had not recovered. She had also had a bunch of seizures, and the family was having a
Mm.
really hard time letting go.
Mm.
It was very complex as to why, but they essentially were keeping her alive when she shouldn't have stayed alive.
Yeah.
So we were providing care for her according to their wishes. But the family was the sweetest people I'd ever met in my life. They were very very proud of their faith, and they
Mm.
were with her 24/7. So I worked night shift, and there was one child of hers. She had so many kids. I think she had like five. One of her sons was a
Aw.
pastor, but the son, I wish I remembered his name. I don't remember his name, but the son that I got close to, I'd had this patient probably for a good month. Like every time I was at work,
Wow.
I had her, and
Wow,
so we
they
had
really were
developed.
committed.
Yeah, well, yeah, she has passed now, but
Mm.
yeah, she was there for a while. Um, but we had developed a really strong relationship, and because I would just talk to them. I mean, I talk to
Yeah.
patients that are not able to respond when I'm like doing things with them, but while I was in the
Mm.
room doing things, I would talk to them. I would tell the patient like I'm doing this, blah blah blah. So, um, we ended up talking about faith, and at this point, there was zero part of me that was questioning Adventism to the point where like and it makes me cringe now. But I was like telling him about Ellen White and like how I was like, yeah, I was like, I've never read like her other books, but I read Steps to Christ, and like that one is really pretty, like beautiful, like
Wait, is
changed my
that the
life, blah
only
blah.
one you had read?
Yeah, so and I'll get
Oh
into that
man.
in a second, but like that's the only one I'd ever read. And I was telling him about like the history of the Adventist Church because, I was just explaining like, some Adventists are really misunderstood, blah blah blah. like it makes me cringe thinking about it now. But we had so many discussions about like God and like his character and it was more relationship based discussions than it was
Yeah.
like religion. And
Yeah.
I remember telling him about how I hadn't been to church since I graduated nursing school and how at that point God had really placed it on my heart. Like I was yearning for community. But the thing is, I didn't want to go to any of the Adventist churches in this area. They were all very traditional, and I just like
Yeah.
it wasn't what I was going for. I went to Crosswalk when I went to Southern. That was my church.
I loved
And
Crosswalk when I was
there
there.
was nothing like that in this environment, and so I was like telling him about those things, and he was like, "Well, why don't you just pray about it?" And I was like, "He's like, ask God, He'll give it to you." I was like, "Oh, yeah,
Dang.
you're right." So that is very important because I did start praying about it, and that was like I said in March. So at that point, I wasn't questioning Adventism. So I was like praying like, God, give me a community that I'm not even aware of. But then I also started looking within the Adventist churches, and fast forward to April. So something that's also interesting and a part of my story is my boyfriend. I told you about him when I went to
Yeah.
or
I remember
academy.
I remember wondering
Yeah.
if you guys would end up dating.
So he was not raised Seventh Adventist, and of
Yeah.
course, being in the Adventist church, that's a big no-no. It's
Mhm.
like the unpardonable sin almost, um,
Pretty
unequally yoked
much.
and all those things. And so I was
Yeah.
of the mindset that like, of course, like he'll convert, and I'm not gonna marry him if he doesn't convert, and yada yada yada. And like he'd grown up in a Christian household, like gone to church. He grew
Yeah.
up in a Methodist household. So like the belief in God and like those values were not different. It was the religion that was
Right.
different, right?
Yeah.
So like throughout our relationship, I was very open about like my expectations for our future when we have kids, things like that. And there were times where we'd talk about it, and he'd be like, "Well, I mean, I will go to church with you on Saturday, but I'm not converting. Like I'm just not like it's Seventh Adventism is crazy. You guys are whack." Like he would tell me that, and I'm like, "You're rude. Calm down. You don't know what you're talking about."
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
And so, I would have these, like, I almost panic attacks, basically, like,
Yeah.
bi-monthly throughout our relationship about the fact that he was not Seventh Adventist, but I felt like God had given him to me. Like, our
Mhm.
love story is a whole different thing, but, like, it started from the age of 16, even before that, and I was like, this is my person. I have felt that to my core for so long. Like, why would
Yeah.
God give me him if this was an issue? So like that
Right.
was like a thing that I was going through, and so in April I was really feeling that I was having one of those moments where I was like having the bi-monthly like freak out about the fact that he wasn't Seventh
Yeah.
Adventist, and he's still in school, but he's gonna graduate soon. So like our future is progressing, and so I've been thinking about that a lot, and
Mhm.
so I was like, I had gotten home from work, one of my work stretches, and he came over and he brought me dinner. And I was like, I need to talk to you about something. Like, it's not that big of a deal, but I just, like, we hadn't talked about it in a while. Like, it was kind of just like, he knew where I stood. I never hid like,
Yeah.
what I believed, but, like, you know. So I basically just told him, like, this is something that's really important to me. I really want us to be on the same page. If we weren't going to have kids, I honestly wouldn't care that much, but I want to raise a family together,
Makes
and I
sense.
don't want our kids,
Yeah.
like, confuse our children. Um,
Right.
and he was like, yeah, I understand that. I was like, we can sit down and like go through the Bible together and like go through what you believe and what I believe. But at that point I was saying that, but I still was like, I'm going to convince you to believe what I believe. Like that's in
Right.
my subconscious. Like that's what I was thinking because that's how you're taught.
Yeah.
Like you're right.
Exactly.
Everyone else is wrong. So, but I was like this man is from the Lord. Like I can't, like it's going to work out. So like that's kind of how I was.
Yeah.
And so he had told me again, like, yeah, I'll go to church with you on Saturday. but I'm not converting. Like,
Yeah.
and I was like, okay. And
Yeah.
at this point too, I would like to probably point out that I was not raised in a conservative Adventist home. I ended up going to conservative academy based on my own choice, not because of the conservativeness, but because of all the other cool things that the academy had going.
Yeah.
I did not grow up reading Ellen White. That was not something that I did. I was in Adventist education in Maryland when I was in kindergarten and first grade. It's not like that was really a big priority, at least where
No.
where I was at. It wasn't something that we were
Yeah. Probably
necessarily
not.
taught. And then I went to public school, and like I went to church throughout that period of time, but it was never like a conservative environment. It was more on the spectrum of Adventism that like talks about like the gospel and like the love of
Mhm.
Jesus, and like even that being said, you can't understand the gospel in the context of Adventism, but
Right. But you
you
think
know,
you can when you're a
you
more
think
chill
you can,
Adventist, you think
right?
you do understand that.
And that's
Yeah.
what I thought my whole life. So yeah, so I was raised in that environment, like relationship over religion.
Mhm.
Ellen
Yeah.
White's not very prioritized, but she's a pioneer, and
Yeah.
I did believe that, and I did believe she was a
Mhm.
prophet, and I knew that there was prophecies within the Adventist church that um, were integral to our belief system, and I didn't really understand them because they were complicated. But I just told myself it's
Yeah.
fine. I don't need to understand it. Like God will take care of me. Whatever. It's
Yeah.
fine. And that's just kind of like the attitude I had. And
Most people,
so,
that is the attitude because it's so confusing. Like, no matter how much you study it, it doesn't necessarily help sometimes.
no. So, so I was talking to Zach, and I was like, we can go through all this together. And he was like, all right. And so we were on the same page. Like, he was agreeable. I was like, this is really important to me. I want you to know, like, I'm never going to choose you over God. Like, God has to come first. Like, I love you, but
Mhm.
this is just how it is. Like, you have to
Yeah.
prove to me that this is something that you're going to take, like, interest in with me, and, like, we'll work through this
Yeah.
together. So I was like, I'm going to look for a church for us to go to. This was on a Wednesday. Okay. So um, this is in the very end of April. I'm going to backtrack
Okay.
here in a second, but very end of April. And so there's like four Amish churches in the area. I
Mhm.
looked into all of them. There was one that I live closer to, so I was like, well, we'll just go to that one. So
Yeah.
that ended up being okay. Actually, I should backtrack. Sorry, the timeline is
You're
is
good.
very important. So April 23rd, we were exploring downtown Knoxville, and at this point,
Uh-huh.
we had not had the conversation that I just discussed. But I mean,
Okay.
it's something he was aware of, but like I hadn't talked about it recently.
Yeah.
And this was after I had started praying for community, and praying that God would give it to me and like show me it,
Mhm.
provide me, take me where He wanted me to go. And so
Mhm.
we're exploring downtown Knoxville, and there's a part of downtown Knoxville called Old City, and it's like the original
Mhm.
city of Knoxville. And I, for some reason, had never explored it. So we're walking around, and there's this cute coffee shop. And I was a bad Adventist. Like I drank coffee. That was the other thing I was trying to explain is as a bad Adventist, you know, in college,
Yeah.
I definitely became more liberal on what I would do on Saturdays because it was the only day of the week I had to do things with my friends as somebody who was
Makes
working
sense.
and in nursing school. And not only that, we didn't have kitchens, and like the food at the cafeteria is disgusting. And I had friends from California, and so they were California Adventists. So it was really easy to kind of just
Which
like
go out to eat all the time.
flow, yeah. So it was easy to like
Yeah.
flow into that environment, and I didn't feel
Yeah.
guilty about it. And I knew that my relationship with Jesus was above all else, and so I didn't feel
Yeah.
like a conviction. I was just like, all right, like this is what I'm doing. But
Yeah.
even more so, like as I hadn't gone to church frequently, so like I said, my boyfriend was not raised in the Adventist church. He was raised Methodist, and he loves college sports. So like I was going to football games on Saturday. We were
Yeah.
big Tennessee Volunteer fans, and like I never felt bad about any of it, but knew that it did not reflect well within the Adventist belief system.
Right. Yeah.
And so anyway, that was one of the things he was talking about. He was like, I'm not missing Tennessee football games because of church on Saturday when you could go to church on Sunday. I would be like,
Yeah, it makes
I'd be
sense.
like, that's not that deep. Like, most games aren't even until after 12 anyway. And so that was like one of
Yeah.
the points I just thought was funny to mention. So anyway,
That is funny.
we go to this coffee shop that we were finding in Old City. It's called Awaken Coffee. We walk inside. It's really cute. And we
Mhm.
sit down waiting for our order. And in the back, there's this chair. And on the chair, next to like this open area in the back, there's like tables and it looks like there's a stage. It says Awaken Church, 11:15 a.m. Sunday. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so
Mhm.
cool. They have a church at this coffee shop. And I just looked it up because I was like, I wanted to see. So I was reading their mission statement and like what they believe. And I was like, this is exactly what I'm looking for. But then I looked at Zach and I was like, why would God lead me? And I really felt like at that moment, like, the God tinge. I was like, the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
I was like, why would God lead me to a Sunday church? And I was raised in a household that didn't really look down upon like Sunday Christians, I didn't feel the same way that the Adventist church felt about them. However, I will say that doesn't mean that the rhetoric was not subconsciously planted in my brain. Like, it was there somewhere.
That's why you felt uncomfortable when there was an option for a Sunday church.
Yeah. And so I was like, but this looks like exactly like what I want. I was like, I guess I could go to church twice a week. And then I was like, well, that's ridiculous. Why, in order to make me feel justified to go here, why would I go to church twice a week? Because I've been to Sunday churches with my friends. Like, I have tons of friends that are Adventist, and like, I never had issues with that. But I was like, but I'm Adventist, like, it's fine, like, But I was like, I don't want to have to feel required to go to church twice a week in order for me to feel like I can go to this like community. And so that was on April 23rd, which is very important because the timeline is just insane. But I remember he was like, well, just go. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. I was like, but if I know. He was
probably so confused. Like, what?
Well, I was like, but if I know the truth and I'm not ignorant to it, how could I do it in good conscience? And the truth as in, like, the Sabbath, right? Yeah. So, anyway, the week later, the very end of July or April, beginning of May, we had that conversation on Wednesday. Okay, so that was, I'll have to backtrack. We had a conversation on Wednesday. On Friday, I was on Instagram. I'm never on Instagram. I have it deleted off my phone. I don't, I get on it occasionally, but, I just don't have a lot of self-control with social media. So, I have the app deleted off my phone. But I got on Instagram just to see what was up. And your post was the first post I saw. And it's never put, Instagram's not chronological anymore, right? And,
no, it's not.
I saw a picture of you and Ian, and I saw, life update. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I want to see what's going on in her life. Even though we hadn't, talked a lot, I just loved watching your life and watching you grow.
Aww.
And so I, was reading through it, and I got to the end, and it said, Ian and I are leaving Adventism. We're going to drop a podcast on Sunday to tell you why. And I was like, Hannah Rain? What?
Because I was way more conservative than you when, you were in academy.
Right, and I saw that you were coming out of that, and I loved that for you. I saw you got a tattoo. I was like, period, love that for her. I was happy for you. But I was like, what? So it wasn't even, a judgment. It was more I'm so intrigued. I want to know what's going on. Yeah. So that was on Friday, and at that point, I still was I wasn't necessarily questioning, but that piqued my interest. I was like, what does Hannah have to say about this? And that the point of me knowing that you are led by God and you have the Holy Spirit in you, and you are in communion with Him, that plays a large role, because I was like, there's no way Hannah would do this unless she really was being led by God. She's got genuine intentions. And so I remember reading that and explaining to Zach, because he doesn't know anything about Adventism and the Adventist culture.
Yeah.
So, you'll never guess what I just read. And so that was on Friday. On Saturday, we had went to that church. So I guess that was Saturday was the 4th. Okay, so that was May the 3rd. The reason I remember that
is so that just helps me remember when our podcast launched, because we were talking about it the other day.
It was May 5th. Yeah.
Wow, you're so good with dates. Oh my gosh.
Well, it's a life transforming story. I just I remember it was Cinco de Mayo because we went out to get Mexican food that day. But yeah, so sorry, something just popped up on my computer. Got to get rid of it.
Oh, you're good.
It's distracting me. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. This thing is so old.
I don't know. You're fine. We can always just cut this section out anyway.
It's true. Okay. So on May 4th, we went to the church that was closest to me, and it was
the Adventist church.
Yeah, it was a very much not what I wanted whatsoever. The complete opposite of what I wanted. We walk in, and there's nothing wrong with having older people in your congregation. I love a mixed age congregation. That's my favorite. Yeah. But it was strictly older generations. There was no young people. And because of that, especially in the Adventist community, all eyes were on us like a hawk. We walk in and everyone's staring at us. And I'm like, all right, well, we already walked in. We can sit down. It's fine. We'll just leave afterwards. And I remember turning to Zach and I said, tell them we have lunch plans. Every single one of these people is going to ask us to their house.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Because not only are we young, but what if we're not Adventists? we gotta
Well, and you
teach them.
probably weren't dressed quite as conservatively
No,
as most
I
of
wasn't.
them were,
I mean,
and so then that's assumed, and
yeah. So I remember enjoying like singing the hymns and like being like in an environment of worship. I was like, wow, I missed that. But it wasn't what I was looking for, not even close. Even more so that when we were leaving, people were introducing themselves. That's fine, you know, being friendly is okay. But the pastor chased us out of the church because we were walking like to get out. We weren't running, but we were walking, and I made eye contact with him in the sanctuary after the sermon, and I was like, I don't want to talk to him. So we're trying to walk out, and we're outside of the church, and he literally ran, and I was like, if I was not Seventh-day Adventist, that would, like, at the moment I was, you know, Seventh-day Adventist, but even if I was, like, it made me uncomfortable. I was like, why are you chasing me? Like, can you please calm down? Like, that is too much. And they were like, oh, are you from Adventist? I was like, oh yeah, born and raised, blah, blah, blah. And Zach was like, I'm not. I was like, don't tell them that.
That was the first question?
Yes. And I was like, wow. They're like, where'd you go to school? I was like, oh, I went to Southern. They're like, oh, okay, come back and see us, blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah, great. We got lunch plans. See ya. So we left, and we get in the car, and I'm like, I'm not going back there. Not happening.
It's intimidating. You got to credit their friendliness, but I know for me that would be a turnoff because it's just it's too much. Yeah, way too much. So then the rest of that day, I remember like being really excited to hear what you had to say on your podcast. I was like, what could it be? Like, I just couldn't even think of it. And I literally, like, I was just like, but I just want to know. And so on Sunday, I downloaded Instagram, and I kept refreshing to see like when you were going to post it. And I literally like kept refreshing. And then it was like mid-afternoon my time that you had posted, like probably like 2 or 3. We had a lot of trouble with it launching that first day. I remember we were sitting in a coffee shop for hours trying to get it to work.
Oh god. But when it came on, I took my AirPods, and like Zach was over at my apartment doing homework on the couch, and took my AirPods and put it on 2 times speed because I was like, I need to hear this.
You want to get to the juicy part.
And so I remember, like, and it's been so long since I listened to the first episode, but I remember, like, as you guys were just touching on the surface of the gospel and, like, what it truly means for your life, but you still touched on it enough for it to, like, break barriers in my brain. And, like, when you were touching on, like, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, things that I was never exposed to as a Seventh-day Adventist. Like, that's just not talked about. Some Adventists I've talked to have said that they've heard it. I've never. I was like, what? And, like, when you had talked about specifically, like, you got into, like, the point of, like, the Sabbath specifically because you were leaving some Adventism. And, like, how through the death of Jesus, he fulfilled the Old Covenant, and he's our eternal rest. And so, like, now I understand all of that to a very, like, deep degree. But at the beginning, it was, like, I was like, whoa, like, what? And, like, there was multiple times, like, in the episode where, like, my jaw was dropping. And I was like, what? Because not only did I trust your genuineness and, like, your relationship with the Lord, and, like, I've never met Ian, but, like, I knew you wouldn't marry some person that didn't have that same kind of
rando.
Yeah, like, and not only that, but, like, he was in seminary, like, so he knew what he was talking about. And both of you had, like, credible, like, backgrounds, and not only did I know you on a personal level, but, like, it's not like you were pulling things out of thin air. Like, you were backing it with a scriptural understanding. And so I remember after the episode ended, I was like, oh my gosh, because not only did I have all of that context, but the context of what God had done the last week of my life, like, has led me to this church. And I was like, because the one thing was, like, Sabbath. Like, that was the one thing for me. I was like, well, if this is true, how can I go against it? Like, that just feels wrong. And at that moment too, I wasn't even thinking about, like, the end time prophecies, because all those things I just, like, push out of my brain. Like, it's there, but I just didn't think about it. So, like, that wasn't even the reason. It was just, like, Sabbath keeping and, like, going to church on Saturday and that being the day of worship and it being a commandment. And so I remember after the episode, I took off my headphones and I looked at Zach and I was like, my life just changed. I was like, I don't fully understand what just happened. But I was telling him about what you guys had talked about. He's like, you didn't know any of that? I was like, no. He's like, what? I was like,
he was probably so confused.
I was like, what do you mean? He's like, you didn't know the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, Jesus died, fulfilled the covenant. I was like, no. I was like, I've never heard those words in my life. And that's the thing too. Like, at first I was like, how did I? Because it's not that I haven't. Like, I've read my Bible. I've never been, like, a crazy, like, dive into it, because first of all, I think the biggest reason, especially in reflection, was because I was so confused about everything that it was intimidating. Like I was like,
Yeah,
I don't.
100%.
So I would read
I
Psalms
felt
and
the
the
same
Gospels,
way.
and that's like all I would
Mm-hmm.
read was like Psalms and the Gospels, and but everything else confused me, and I was like, I don't even know where to start. I don't want to get into it. Like, so I wasn't a big Bible scholar, but I still was like, how have I never come across this? Like, but in my understanding of like now, what I know is like one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that's talked about, and you guys have talked about, but also I've listened to the former Adventist podcast, which has been
Mm-hmm.
very, very helpful
It's
as
very
well.
helpful, yeah.
Is like when you truly understand the weight of the gospel and what it has done for your
Mm-hmm.
life and what it means, and you're like you have in your heart and the Holy Spirit's living in you, it illuminates scripture. So
Yeah.
honestly, like the first time I picked up my Bible was probably a month ago, because even after all of this, and I still have more details to go for the story, I still was just like confused, not necessarily confused, but like it was still intimidating in a sense. And
Yeah.
it wasn't until recently that I felt very solid. And so I was like, okay, I can pick my Bible up. And I remember I started in Acts and I was reading it and I was like, oh my gosh. Like, because it was like a whole different person was reading this Bible. And it
Yeah.
was so much easier to digest, and it was so much
Mm-hmm.
more applicable, and there was life to the words.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, like what? And like
Yeah.
then like recently I just started listening to the former Adventist podcast, and I'll get into why, but they talked about like how like when you're born again, like the Holy Spirit illuminates scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about like the pioneers, the Adventist pioneers, about how like if they didn't have a true understanding of the gospel, then it wasn't the Holy Spirit that was
Mm-hmm.
illuminating scripture, and they were just looking for what they wanted to believe. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, like, and it just like blows my mind, even like reading the Bible now. Like, and now I have like a thirst for it. Like, I'm like thirsty to keep
Yes.
reading and to keep, and I've never felt that in my life, and I always felt guilty for
Mm.
that. Like, I was like, well,
I
I'm not,
understand. I relate to that exact
like,
same
I'm
experience.
not
Yeah.
like the other Christians. Like, I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to, like, I'll read the gospel. That's sweet. I like Psalms because David's a human who's experiencing human
Mm-hmm.
emotions that I can relate to. But like,
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with anything else. And so that's been really transformative. But back to the timeline of things. So um, that was May 5th. I'm talking to Zach,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a lot more open to conversation. And I was like, so I said to him, I was like, oh no, did my AirPods just die? Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Okay. They made like a weird sound. Let me charge one of them just in case.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I
Actually,
can still hear you fine.
okay. But I remember talking to him, and I was like, you seem like a wall has like come down. Like something has come down. You're more
Mm.
willing to talk. And he's like, well, Lexie, you don't understand. Like you were a brick wall. Like it was your way. You were right. Nothing else was right. So what was the point in even talking
Mm.
to you? And I was like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. And like in that moment, like I already felt a shift in our relationship for the better, and it's grown so much since then. But I couldn't stop talking about it from that moment on, and I could not wait for you guys to release more like episodes, because I knew you were gonna
Mm.
touch on like the understandings of like the gospel and the Holy Spirit more. And at first, like I said, like I really wasn't going like to the Bible. Like I was listening to what you guys said. I trusted your word, and you were using biblical texts in your episodes anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'll never forget like the episodes you did on like the Holy Spirit, the episodes you did going in more depth about the Sabbath, the
Mm.
episodes you did about freedom from offense. That changed me. But like
Mm.
once I grasped what the gospel meant, and like in it all of its
Mm-hmm.
simplicity, and like Jesus did all of that for me, every single ounce.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I understood that, because I wasn't your
Yeah.
typical Seventh Day Adventist that was like, oh, well, I have to work for it.
Right.
But I realize now that it wasn't that. It was all the other extra biblical doctrine fed to me of like the end
Yeah.
times and the end time prophecy and like
You got
all
a
of those
lot of that at
things.
Academy too.
I
You may
did.
not have read a lot of that stuff yourself, but
No.
there was some pretty intense talks that would happen
Yes.
at the Academy that were
Yes.
so intense that even in my conservativeness at the time, I had to distract myself on my phone because I could not handle some of those
Yeah,
talks because they were
and during
so
those
like just
talks,
ah.
they were all the time. But during those talks, I'd be like, well, this doesn't make sense. Like, God's gonna take care of me. I don't believe God's gonna turn all these people, like, they're not gonna go to heaven because they're not Sunday keep like Christians or whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't believe any of it, but like, even if I didn't claim it, it still was like in the
It still got
deep
into your
recesses
head.
of my brain. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, so that's all the things that were stopping me, because I didn't even realize too, like, even though I got a lot of that at academy, it also, like, I did experience it going to church, and I did experience it in the day academy I went to that wasn't as
Yeah.
conservative. But I just forgot about it, so I didn't know where it was coming
Mm-hmm.
from. But I once I recognized, like, oh, those are the things that were feeding everything that stopped me from accepting the gospel.
Okay, Lexi's AirPods died, so we are here with some different headphones. I'm
Yeah.
trying to remember what part you were. Oh, you were just talking about how like in academy you had, um, some of that stuff had entered your head even though you didn't even fully realize where it came from.
Right. Yeah. So that, I think, was like what had stopped me, and I mean, it makes sense as to what has stopped me from accepting the gospel, because even if I didn't choose to claim those things, they still somehow were in my subconscious. Like, I was raised from the moment I could remember thinking about the end time prophecies and like what that meant for me, to the point where, like, I distinctly remember being a sophomore in high school, and we were having
Mm-hmm.
worship, and because you start class with worship, and it was worship about end times, and there was like this tape. I don't remember the name of it, but I distinctly remember it was a story that this girl, she was going through the end times persecution, and she was in jail, and she was about to face trial, and she was in the jail cell singing hymns, but also trying to rack her brain to make sure that she apologized for every single sin she committed, because if she didn't apologize for one of them, she was not going to have salvation. And like that
That's what Ellen White says.
distinctly, like, it distinctly like burned into my brain, to the point where I
Mm.
started in my daily prayer. My prayer was, please forgive me for the sins I've committed that I'm aware of and not aware of. Like, I
Yeah.
started praying that every day because of that
Mm.
one thing.
Story.
And
Yeah.
I also totally forgot about the doctrine of investigative judgment. Like, totally forgot about that, because number one, it wasn't talked about in my household, and the only places I heard it was in school. And
Yeah.
so then when I heard about that, I was like, wait, but that was subconsciously in my brain, because now I do
Yeah.
see how, like, I did have this, like, I accepted Jesus' salvation, but somewhere inside of me, I didn't truly know
Mm-hmm.
if I had it. And like,
Yeah.
wouldn't be sure until he came back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what's taught. And so
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, like, of course, being in that environment for 23 years of my life, of course it's
Mm-hmm.
going to affect me some way. And not
Oh
only that,
yeah.
but 7 generations of people before me in my family were Seventh Adventists. So,
That's
um,
wild.
so once I like started recognizing those things, it was a lot easier for me to see the simplicity of the gospel and accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I first truly grasped it, I had, and I believe all of these feelings were not of God, but definitely from the devil. I was going
Mm.
back and forth in my mind, like in circles of like, what if they're wrong? Like, what if this isn't true? And then like I remember thinking, but like, what is the gospel, Lexie? Like, what is the gospel? And like I'd have to remind myself, like, the things like you guys were saying, well, the gospel is Jesus. It's not Jesus plus this, it's not Jesus plus that. Like,
Mm.
it's Jesus. And if that is that right? Yeah, that's right. So why is
Mm-hmm.
anything else, like, everything else that's going through my brain just isn't truth? It's not
Mm.
accurate. And these feelings that I'm getting are not from God. They're definitely from the
Mm-hmm.
devil, and they're all placed in my head of all these years of subconscious rhetoric of the Seventh Adventist Church
Mm-hmm.
that directly affects how you see the world, how you understand Jesus, how you understand what the gospel has done for you and what the finished work on the cross means. And it like
Mm.
literally plays into every single aspect of your life. And I didn't even understand that to myself. I was like, what? I wasn't even that much of an Adventist. Like, like
Yeah. I
how
remember
is
when you messaged me, I was like, oh wow, I never would have anticipated that it would be such a big thing for you because you were always the like not like super legalistic, like, I was way more legalistic than you were back at least at the beginning of my time at that academy. I think after you left, I actually started studying stuff out, the old covenant, the new covenant. I didn't leave Adventism, but that was kind of the beginning of my journey, was probably my second year there. But yeah, I remember being like, dang, I'm surprised that made such a big impact for her because like I thought she was like just super chill and like, but what I understand now is you can be a super chill Adventist, but that stuff is still there unless you
yeah,
consciously let go of it.
right. And there's like no way to do that and still be a part of that community. Like, you just can't.
Mm-mm.
Like, you might think that you
No,
can, but you can't. And
no.
so yeah, so then I remember, like, right after all that happened, one of my best friends from nursing school, her name is Megan. We're still really good friends to this day. She actually just came. She was the friend that came to visit me this week. Um,
Aw.
but she and I had not seen each other since she graduated nursing school. And this is May 8th, okay? So I listened to the podcast on May 5th. This is May 8th. She had texted me and said, oh my gosh, I'm in Knoxville. Do you want to get lunch? Like, I'm here for an orthodontist appointment. This also, the date of this, I think is very interesting, and it doesn't seem coincidental to me. May 8th was the day I graduated nursing school. So it's 2 years to the day that I graduated nursing school. Megan is in town, and I go to get lunch with her. And I had known Megan throughout nursing school. We were very, very close, very similar, and like our passion for nursing, how we studied, how we saw things. And we actually never hung out outside of like seeing each other in the library and talking in class because we were both so busy, but we had like a deep connection. So I remember throughout nursing school, her relationship with God was something that I always like looked up to because she was, you could just see the Spirit in her. Like you could see Jesus in her. And she had such a deep faith. And I also remember thinking in nursing school, I was like, I don't know if she's still Adventist. Like I know she was born and raised Adventist, but the reason I thought that was because I knew, like, number one, like she would go to coffee shops on Saturday and study. And I would always think, like, why wouldn't you take that opportunity to, like, you know, relax? And I didn't really judge her, but I was like, I don't know, like, and there's just certain things she said, like, I could kind of tell, like, oh, maybe she's, like, not Adventist, but she's obviously Christian. And so when we met up, we, like, caught up on things, and then I wasn't sure if I was even ready to talk about it yet because I had so many questions in my brain, but I was like, you know, Megan's, like, a safe space. So I gave her, like, the rundown, and she was like, oh, my gosh, Lexie, she was like, I'm not some Adventist. I've actually been a non-denominational Christian for, like, the last 3 years or greater or something like that. She was like, I'm so happy for you that you've come into this. She's like, but I want to encourage you to wrestle with your faith. Like, God does not discourage that. And she was like, everything you're feeling about, like, well, what if this is wrong, and what if I, like, am doing something wrong and that can affect my salvation? She's like, that's not from God. She's like, they are right. Like, the gospel is that simple. And so we talked about that for a while, and then she was like, I told her about that church, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I really want to go to church, but I don't want to go alone. She was like, well, how about like this? We plan a weekend. I come into town. I'll go with you. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes. Because as of this point, like, Zach was back in Greenville for the summer, and he's doing an internship. So, and I just don't like doing things alone. So I was like, awesome. Yeah. So she came in June, and it was at this point, it was like the third week of June. So it'd been 4+ weeks since I heard your podcast episode. I sent it to her, so she had listened to it. We go to this church. It was the coffee church. I walk in. The sermon is literally directly about the old covenant, new covenant, what Jesus has done on the cross, his finished work, to the point that the pastor said a line that was almost word for word of something you and Ian had said. And Megan and I looked at each other, and I was like, oh my gosh. Like, wow. I was like, there's no way. Like, it was like 5 weeks since I had listened to the first episode. And I remember getting like full body chills. And after that, the pastor was talking like people in the congregation. It's a smaller church. And he introduced himself. He was very like, he wasn't overbearing. He was very like,
he didn't chase you
relaxed.
out.
No. And I kind of gave him a very short synopsis of like what led me there, like a 5-minute synopsis. And he's like, yeah, I've heard about some Adventism. You know, it's interesting. And I was like, yeah. He's like, well, I'm so glad that you found it here. Like, we're a wonderful community. I would love to like talk to you more. But I remember leaving that and saying to Megan, like, you know, if this was the opposite, like if I was a Sunday going church member who went to a Seventh-day Adventist church and told the pastor that, there would be a completely different reaction. Like the pastor would be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you found truth. Like, so glad you're here. Like, it would be like, and that's something I always hated about the Adventist churches. I felt like they were vultures. Like, these people who love the Lord very obviously, why are we trying to grasp onto them?
Convert them.
We're the only way that they can be saved. But that was because like I didn't truly believe what I was being taught about the end times. Just like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, I know so many Christians who are not some Adventists that have a deeper walk with the Lord and reflect him in such a higher capacity than so many people I've seen within this church. Like, so that's part of the reason I really didn't get it. And I also, I think too, part of the reason like I didn't want to study the Bible or was afraid of it was because I felt like the God I know, like, he's not the God I'm being taught about. But what if the truth is in there and they're actually right? and like I can't handle that. Like
That's so funny because I had so many similar experiences. That's why I never read Daniel and Revelation really, because it
yeah.
was like it's scary. What if God is actually mean? Like I don't want to
Yeah.
know.
Right. It's like I just didn't want to confront it. So like I was
Yeah.
like, I can't hold on to that. So yeah, we ended up going to that church and had that experience. And then interesting enough is like after that first time that I went, I had so many things planned on my weekends off that because I work every other weekend essentially,
Mm.
that I didn't get to go back to that church until November.
Oh
But
wow.
throughout that time, I was listening to like every single episode you and Ian put out. I listened to your
Mm.
episodes on my way to work, and I was just like eating it up and like just so many different things that you were explaining. And I think it came a lot easier for me once I got past the feelings of anxiety and like truly
Yeah.
like felt like peace and comfort and what the gospel truly means for my life.
Mm.
Everything else was coming a lot easier, and
Yeah.
I think that that was from the fact that I had already had an established relationship with Jesus, and
Yeah, exactly.
everything that I was being taught was directly in line with his character and who I knew him to
Mhm.
be. And
Yeah.
not only that, but like you obviously were supporting it with biblical text. And I remember you guys were talking about Hebrews, and you're like, go and read Hebrews, go and read Hebrews. And recently, I went in and read Hebrews, and then I was listening to sorry, my dog just barked.
Oh,
I was
you're good.
listening
It's not as loud
to
with the headphones.
I was listening to the former Adventist podcast, and they were talking about how, like, with the end time prophecies, how like Adventists truly believe like it's not finished until Jesus comes and then He decides your
Yeah.
salvation. And I was reading Hebrews, and yesterday I went back and read it. I already highlighted it, but I totally forgot because it was a while ago. Not forgot, but just
Mhm.
it's Hebrews
Yeah.
9, and it's verse 28. So also Christ was offered once for all time as a sacrifice to take away the sins of many people. He will come again, not to deal with our sins, but to bring salvation to all who are eagerly waiting for Him. I was like,
So good.
oh my gosh, like that was right in front of me. That has been there the whole time.
Isn't it shocking? It's like,
Like,
wait, how did I miss this?
yeah. And like then I was like the verse Hebrews 9 verse 10. For the old system deals only with food and drink and various cleansing ceremonies, physical regulations that were in effect only until a better system could be established. A better system, the new covenant,
New
Jesus
covenant.
fulfilling
Yeah.
everything. Like
Yeah.
it's right there. It is in plain
Mhm.
text. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, and so that's what I'm talking about, like the Holy Spirit illuminating Scripture, all of these truths being magnified, and they're so simple and they're not complicated, and it's not supposed to be
Yeah.
complicated. And like
Exactly.
the doctrine of this church within Ellen White making it complicated, and the
Mhm.
like as I was coming out of it, even before you guys made the episode about like what you believe about Ellen White is important, and
Mhm.
the Adventist Church being a cult organization, it really
Mhm.
is. Like I don't even have a problem saying that because it is. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I literally had thoughts of I'd rather be dead before the end time so I don't have to go through the suffering.
Girl, same. All of my growing up years, I used to pray that I would die so that I didn't have to go through the investigative judgment. Like as a
Yeah.
12-year-old, I'd be like, God, please let me get in a car accident so I don't
Yeah.
have to. Like, what?
Like
That's kind of messed
that's
up.
crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And like just too like and this I think this concept too that I'm about to talk about like happens outside of the Seventh Adventist Church, but like the concept of wanting to suffer and things having to be so hard all the time, like and that's how it's supposed to be. That's
Yeah.
like very big within Adventism, and I'm like, but that's not how it's supposed to be. Like
Mm.
it's supposed to be wonderful. You're supposed to be filled with the joy of the Lord. And
Yeah.
that's the other thing that definitely changed my life and my perspective too, is when you guys were talking about how like through the gift of salvation and Jesus literally giving you a new heart versus what the Adventist Church talks
Mhm.
about, like the heart is wicked,
Yeah.
and living in a mindset of have versus a mindset of lack. That changed my life.
Mm.
Like no, like I have joy, I have peace, I have
Mhm.
compassion, I have kindness, I have self-control. I have these
Yeah.
things. And so my prayer changed from God, please give me these things, to God, please remind me to use the tools you've already given me. And that has
Yes.
changed my life. Like
So much.
so much in every aspect, in the nurse I am, and the girlfriend I am, and the friend I am,
Yeah.
and like the daughter I am. Like it has
Mhm.
absolutely transformed me. To like I just am so filled with the Spirit that like I understand the woman at the well. I didn't used to get her. I was like, He told you things you knew about yourself. Okay, great. Like
So.
like I was like, but now I'm like, no wonder she ran around telling everyone, like, she couldn't shut up. I can't shut up.
Yeah.
Like, how could you shut up? It's all I talk
Yeah.
about. And I just, the more I learn and the more I'm grasping, and so, like, now that I have a solid foundation of what the gospel means for me in my life and how it's transformed me, I am able to dive into the other stuff that I want to know more of the nitty-gritty about, especially in, like, the aspect of having kids in the future and what am I going to teach them. And I, through that process, have been listening to the former Adventist podcast, and they're going through, like, the fundamental beliefs, like, each and every single one with an Adventist book. And I didn't realize how many things I still had in my subconscious that were Adventist based.
Yeah.
I was like, what? Like, that's from Adventism?
Yeah.
That's not from the Bible? Like,
it still happens to me. Yeah.
So now I'm doing the work, and it's not in a spirit of anxiety, but I'm like, how much do I not know? And, like, I was talking to one of my friends who I went to Southern with, and I had shared recently my testimony with her. Zach and I went on a double date with her and her husband, and she was like, oh my gosh, like, I sent her your podcast, and she's like, I feel like a new Christian, like a new baby Christian who doesn't know anything. And I was like, I feel the same way. Like, my relationship with Jesus doesn't feel new because that has been since the moment I came out of the womb. But the understanding of, like, how everything else plays within the lens of the gospel and how to interpret it with the lens of the gospel, that feels so brand new, because that's not how the Adventist church runs at all. Like, we talk about, oh yeah, Jesus died for you, but this is everything else you need to understand because he died for you. And these are all the things that you should be doing. And, like, the rhetoric of, like, Jesus died for you, and because of that, you want to follow the law. You want to do these things. Like, it changes you to want it. When you have that mindset, like, you're not going to succeed. And that's the whole point, and that's why he did it all, because he knew that.
Exactly.
Like,
he knew you couldn't do it.
You couldn't do it. And, like, just when you grasp that, like, it seems so simple, but you can't understand it until you unless that key's unlocked, you can't grasp it. And the point you guys made about, like, at some point, I don't remember what episode it was, but you said, the devil's not afraid of you understanding or hearing the gospel. He's afraid of you understanding it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I didn't understand it. I had heard it. Many people that are just like me today, that were just like me within the Adventist church that I love and know deeply, they hear it, they don't understand it, and they think that they do. And that's why I'm so passionate about it. Like, I have so much passion, just as much as I feel like it comes out in y'all's podcast episodes, that, like, I want to share it so much, but I also don't want to come at it from a front where I'm, like, stepping on toes or making people feel like they're stupid or like they don't know Jesus, because it's like, no, like, I knew Jesus and I was in it. But it's like, I can't keep quiet because I am living a life that is so much better than I ever thought it could be. And I just can't stop. Like, that's part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast episode, because, like, I wanted to share my testimony on a bigger platform, because it's not like I'm, like, out here on social media like, oh, I'm not Adventist anymore. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not afraid of it, and I'll talk about it. But this is a more cohesive way that I felt like I could get that message out there. And it's not that I necessarily feel like I have this huge influence on all these people's lives, but there's so many people that, like, we mutually know that are within the church that I'm like, well, maybe if they, like, saw, oh, Lexie did an episode with them, I haven't talked to her in forever, maybe, like, let's hear what she has to say.
Maybe they'll
and,
listen.
Like, maybe it'll open a door somewhere and change their lives and change generations of lives. Like, I have got friends that are within the Adventist church that are married that are wonderful people, godly people, and I know they know the Lord, and I love them so much. And it's like, here's this great news you think you've heard, but you haven't, and, like, you need to hear it. And I'm so passionate about it, and it's so funny because Megan, so she went through this journey a couple years ago, but, like, as I'm learning these things and talking about them with her, there's certain things that she hasn't even necessarily recognized either, so we'll talk about it. And then, like, one of our mutual friends, she introduced me to, his name is Brian. He was not raised in the Seventh Adventist Church. He went to school, got his degree in theology, and so he'll be hearing us, like, talk about our experience with the Adventist Church, and, like, he's like, like, the other day he came to visit with her, and he was like, you know, it's almost awesome, your testimony, because you're in your 20s and you're on fire for God in a way that most people aren't. Like, if it's something they've heard their whole life, like, they like, they understand it and they appreciate it, but the weight of it that you're feeling right now, a lot of people don't get to experience that. And he's like, that's like awesome. Like, I'm glad you're having that experience and that you're learning all these things and that it's been changing your life and like you're going to show that to all kinds of people. And I've even noticed like going to work, like my patients will make comments about like me having like a glow to me, and I'll be like, that's literally Jesus. Like, that's not me. Like, that's the Lord. And like everything feels lighter. I will listen to worship music now, and it would touch me before, but now it like touches me. Like whenever I think about what Jesus did for me, like I start crying. And like I would get emotional to that point before, but not even to the same weight, because it was I felt it in that moment, but then that moment left, and it was like all the subconscious stuff was there that I didn't even know. Like the weight of the anxiety of not knowing whether or not I had salvation, that being lifted, had no idea I had it, had no idea it was there, and how much it impacted me. And how much like it just changed, like it's changed my entire life. I can go on and on about how much it's done that and how much you've played a role in that, and like the timeline in which it happened. Like God totally used you tangibly in my life. There's a reason that I went to that academy. There's a reason that I met you. Like I said before, I'm grateful for there's positives that I experienced within that community. And I can see how that worked in my life. And I do believe that God can use things that aren't necessarily beautiful, things that are broken, and make things that are beautiful. I do believe people within that organization truly have a relationship with Jesus.
Oh, 100%.
And it's just like, but when you step back and the further removed I've gotten, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, how did I not see any of this? Especially when I wasn't claiming all the distinctive doctrines that make that church the church. Like, I didn't claim them, I didn't share them, I didn't agree with them, but I still like, associated with it because it's all I knew. Like, it's all you know.
And you subconsciously believed them, even if you didn't like consciously believe them.
Yes, and it's so damaging. And so that's, I feel like there was something else within that timeline. I kind of went off on a ramble, and I've been taking up most of the talking time, giving you questions.
No, I'm glad. That's why I had you on here.
But yeah, it's just like right now I'm living in the freedom of the gospel in a way that I've never, ever experienced it before. Life is so much sweeter. And I'm trying to dive into the other things, but it's so nice to dive into them without fear. And more so just like hunger for the truth, and how much easier the truth comes when you understand it through the lens of the gospel. Like, it's insane. And you guys, I cannot believe some of the comments I've read. I honestly can't read them because it makes me mad. But some of the things
we've deleted the worst ones too. Some of them were like, wow,
I can't believe them. I'm like, you guys are proving her point. Like, you're proving her and Ian's point, and you don't even see it. And it's like, what? Like, that is so wild to me. And actually, something that's interesting is one of the former staff members at the academy. They were there my junior year of high school. I don't think they were there when you were there. I actually need to respond to his message, but I saw him underneath your post, and
I think I know who you're talking about, because he was defending what we had shared, and I was really surprised because I'm like, I know he worked there the year before me, and so I was like, oh wow, that's interesting.
So it actually didn't surprise me, but like it did in a way, but it did, because when I knew him, he was the shining light of the Lord in that academy.
I heard so much good stuff about him. So much.
Him and his wife exemplified the Holy Spirit, and they were so tangibly the hands and feet of Jesus in my life. And his class, like, and I guess, I honestly need to get back to him. I haven't got back to him just because I totally forgot that he responded to me, and that was like 2 months ago. But his class, like, I don't know where he was with his understanding or his journey at that time. And he shared the gospel in a way that I probably could have received it the most within the Adventist church that I'd ever heard it in my life. And it changed my life in that time. And he was just so full of God and full of the Spirit. And when they left, there was like a void that just couldn't be filled. And so when I saw that he was commenting those things, I was not shocked that he was the one doing it, but I was like, what journey have you taken? So like, I could tell. I was like, all right. Like, I friends with him on Facebook, and so I saw like that he'd made a career change and that he was a chaplain. And
I saw that too. Yeah.
So I'd messaged him, and not only that, but I also saw, and this is like maybe like bold of me to assume, but I saw like evidence of legalism fading away in their lives, because like his wife used to be beautiful lady, love her to death. Used to be somebody who was convicted of like wearing skirts all the time, and I saw pictures of her
Yeah.
in jeans, and I was like, oh, okay. And so I
Yeah.
messaged him, and I was like, hey, like I just wanted to tell you about what's going on in my life, and I noticed that you were under these like comment sections, and I just was really intrigued to like hear about where you're at, where you and your wife are at. I want you to know that like you were a huge impact on me in that period of my life, and I've always thought of you when I thought of like a godly influence,
Yeah.
and you made a positive impact. And so I'm very curious to see like where you're at now, because it would make sense to me that like you would come to these conclusions too, just based off of the way you taught. And I haven't responded to his message, but I did read it, and he said, he's like, you know, me and my wife, we are no longer Seventh Adventists. We are Christians,
Wow.
and we are living in the truth of the gospel, and I am so happy to hear from you. And he'll probably maybe hear this and be like, she hasn't responded. I will respond. I totally forgot to respond, and then also I want to take time to respond and be like,
Yeah,
but,
it's hard when it's like well, that's why it took me so long sometimes to reply to some of your messages, because I was just like, oh my gosh, this is crazy.
It's crazy. It's a lot, and I get it, but just seeing that too, because I'm like somebody that like exemplified truth in the best way he could within that environment, like is going to truth. And two, like at the beginning, I think one of the hard things for me was like the whole like the shaking, and like I never read Ellen White, but I had heard about that, and
the shaking.
You guys touched on it, and I was like, is this the shaking? Like, am I part of the shaking? Are all these prominent people being
We got
a part
so
of
many
the
comments
shaking?
about the fact that we were part of the shaking.
Yes. And I read that, and I'm like, how do you? I get it when it's, especially in a context that's so much more legalistic than I was raised in, how it'd be easier to be convinced of those things. But it's so confusing to me, because like, for instance, the episodes that were done with Pastor Chris, I think his name is, that Ian did with him. So first of all, those are incredible episodes. Second of all, the second episode he did with him after he did the first one, where he had like gotten fired, and he had talked about in that episode how when he was sitting in front of the board of these people, and they were asking him to defend his beliefs, how at the end of it, he was like, if anything, this has solidified me in what I believe more so, to the point where I don't understand why you guys are not searching for truth. Like you're that's not your goal here. You're not searching for truth, and you're not like upholding that, and that's not what you want, because it's evident. Like if that was the case, then you would be willing. And I understand the like logistics of, if you're going to be a Seventh Adventist pastor and you're going to preach against the doctrine, then they don't want you.
Oh, to be honest, like, we should have been fired. He should have been fired. Maybe not the way that it went down, but I get it.
Right.
Like, you don't want somebody in your church preaching the opposite of what you're preaching. Like, just like a non-denominational church wouldn't want an Adventist pastor doing a Revelation seminar. I'd be like,
right. But at the same time, like, if your goal is Jesus, and your goal is truth, and your goal is the gospel, like, why are you so against hearing that? And like, it's definitely more nuanced than that, but like, that alone to me, like all of those things, it's like one thing after the other. It's been like brick by brick that I've been building this new understanding of my faith, and I will never get over how God used you to do that. And if he's doing it with my life, like how many other lives is he doing it with? I just, it's the best thing I've ever experienced. And like, I used to not understand other Christians, and most of them, I don't think actually I looked at a single person in the Adventist church and thought, wow, like they like love being a Christian, and life seems so full and filled, and like you saw some aspect of it that was like the fear, the works mindset, right? But I would look at these other Christians and be like, they look so filled with the Spirit. Their life is full of so much joy. They don't live life in this subconscious fear. Like, where are they getting that? And
that was one of the big things for me that actually made me start questioning while I was at the academy. It was during COVID, I went to Passion Conference online. So during COVID, they did their whole conference online, and it was the first time I had like watched something like that. And I watched the entire conference because it was over Christmas break and I was home alone, so I had nothing else to do. And I remember texting my pastor friend and being like, I don't know what to think. That these people have way more of the Holy Spirit than I've ever seen within Adventism. And that feels wrong. If we have the
Yeah.
truth, why did they have the Holy Spirit? And that
Yeah.
honestly made me start. I didn't start necessarily questioning Adventism, but I was like, something is wrong about what I've believed, because they clearly have the Holy Spirit in a way that I've never seen before.
Yeah.
And so something's not right about what I believe or what I grew up
Yeah.
believing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so crazy. And like the other thought pattern I used to have within Adventism was like I had the thought pattern of like, man, life would be so much easier if I was atheist. Like if I didn't know any of this, life would be so much easier. And now I'm like, life is so much easier that I have Jesus and I understand the gospel. Like how could you live life
Yeah.
like this, not having this understanding? Like I am so grateful for it. It doesn't do anything but make my life better. Like
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah.
aspect of me that is like,
Literally.
oh man, I'm so burdened by the knowledge of truth. Like, no,
Yeah.
I am
The
not
truth will
burdened
set
by
you
the knowledge of
free.
truth. The truth will set you free. And that's the
Yeah.
part that I just like, it just makes me like almost laugh, honestly, like seeing the comments of like, well, go do whatever you want now, like since you're
Did
not
you see
like
the ones go do
victim
whatever
to
you want because
sin.
you're gonna be in hell for the rest of your life?
Yes.
It's like, wow,
And I'm
thank
like,
you.
you're just like, they're missing the point, and it's like right in front of them. And I understand it's like psychologically, it's a lot more than just like it's brainwashing.
It's
Like,
hard.
we've been brainwashed,
Yeah,
and so like being
exactly.
confronted with that, especially with the aspect of like, well, everyone else is wrong. We're right. We have the truth. Like, and if you're entrenched in
It's
that,
hard.
especially in those circles, like it's not something that you can easily come out of. The Holy
Yeah.
Spirit can definitely work through it, but you know, like I guess for me and you and others like us, the only way we can confront it is with 100% truth. Like you can't beat around the bush. You have to
No.
you have to say it, call it like it is.
And it's an uncomfortable process for anybody, just like it was uncomfortable for you when you started listening. You know, for us, I don't know if I had told you about Former Adventist, but that was actually the thing that I had started
Yeah.
listening to. A friend sent those episodes to me, and when they sent them to me, I was like, I don't believe you. But it was somebody I really loved, and so I was like, I'll listen to it to humor them. And
Yeah.
I listened to it, and I was like, oh. So then I
Yeah.
listened to more, and then I was like, Ian, you need to listen to this. This is like, what? And yeah, that was a big thing that like then led us to start doing our own study. And I was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much to this. Like there's actually a problem.
Yeah. It's been like recently, like I said, where I've like heard things. I'm like, that was Adventism. Like for instance, they did the episode about the end time prophecy and like the millennium, and they were talking about like, and all these things I truly have never studied on my own because it scared me. But I knew what the Adventist Church taught, but I thought a lot of this was from the Bible. But they had talked about like how during the millennium the saints would go to heaven and do the investigative judgment part, and they would all be in heaven, and then after that they would come back to earth with the New Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and Satan would be destroying it. None of that's in the Bible.
I know. It was shocking to me.
I was like what? Like I thought that was in the Bible. Like,
I know.
oh my gosh, like that is
Well,
so
that's the
wild.
scary thing, is because you start to believe so many things that you are convinced are in the Bible, and you don't realize it's not there. And that's been a huge thing for me, because like I grew up reading so much Ellen White, and it just all gets mixed in, especially the Conflict of the Ages series, because she's going through the Bible, but then she's adding her perspective to it. And so there's still times that I'll be like talking about something, and Ian's like, that's not in the Bible. I'm like, wait, what? And then I go like read, and I'm like, it's not there. Like, I didn't, like, what?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
No, it's so crazy. So I'm like, what do I need to unlearn, like that I think is truth? And so actually the biggest reason I got into it is because even at the beginning of this whole thing, the two things that I held on from Adventism that I like wasn't going to let go of, and had even talked to Zach about because of relation of like, what are we going to raise our kids to believe, was the state of the dead and hell being like not being eternal. And I remember like being like, well, that just makes sense to the character of God. And then like in the episode, it was crazy because they were reading my mind, because they were like, we were always taught that this was comforting, that this was peaceful, that this was, and I was like, you're reading my mind. Like, how did you? But that's what's taught, and I didn't even realize.
Yeah.
So I listened to the episode on the state of the dead the other day, and I'm still like grasping it, because, you know, 23 years of believing something, and then believing this belief that absolutely changes my entire perception of everything. But just like hearing those things, I'm like, now I'm ready to hear them, because I have a solid foundation in the gospel. But I can't imagine hearing all of that at once. Like,
Well, that's why
all of
God
those
doesn't give
things
you
at
all of it
once.
at once. Like, it
Yeah,
takes, and there's still things like that we're still studying. And I think, like, it's good to hear other people's perspective and then to take that perspective and then go,
you study it yourself.
study about it.
Yeah,
And then, because there's so many different perspectives out there.
for sure.
But yeah, it's weird to come to it with an open mind instead
Yeah.
of like being set that like
Yes.
everything is wrong, but this one mindset to be like, okay,
Yes.
I'm willing to actually read my Bible and study and see what I find instead of being
Yeah.
like, it has to say this.
Yes.
It's a totally different way of looking at it.
It's been crazy for me to experience it like that because like I was never ever even open and would just be like, well, no. And one of the things that was crazy for me in their episode of it, and like I said, like I just listened to it the other day, and I definitely need to do like my own thing. But they were talking about how, because one of the verses that Adventism uses to like solidify that belief is in Ecclesiastes, where King Solomon's like, the dead know nothing, and they were talking about the context, and that's a word I've learned, the hermeneutics, the context of that book, and like that it's him writing in like a mostly poetry sense, but it's talking about like spiritual aliveness and spiritual deadness, and like what does it mean to be spiritually alive versus spiritually dead, and speaking in that context, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, because those are things that are fed to you. The dead know nothing. Like, that's what I was just like, it's right there, but it's right there surrounded by what? Like, what's the context? And that's the thing, too, is like, the way that I was taught to read the Bible, they present it in a way that we understand context and that everyone else doesn't understand context. And
but we don't even look at context at all.
And, like, too, the other thing that I just, like, listened to, and I still need to look at it, too, but, like, was, like, the belief of the rapture was something that we were always taught was complete hogwash. Like, that's just not real. That doesn't exist. That's hogwash. They misunderstood it. They misinterpreted it. And they were talking about the second coming and how genuinely the Bible doesn't mention a single thing that would make the believer be afraid. And that it's like a quick thing that happens, and it's not fearful whatsoever, and it's not like over this like long period of time. And I was like, so there's not a single part of it that I have to be afraid of? What? Like, I can think about it with like this peace and joy, like, all of it, because before, I told myself, I have the peace of God. He'll take care of me. He takes care of the sparrows. He will take care of me. I'm not going to worry about it. But that didn't change. I worried about it. Like, I worried about it. But now I'm like, oh my gosh, like, it's not fearful, not a single part of it. Like, what do you mean? It's supposed to be that good?
Well, being at Passion last year, Ian and I went with some friends of ours, and their theme song was "He Who Is to Come." I don't know if you've heard the song, but it's all about like Jesus come, and like the chorus of it is that verse from Revelation, like, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." And there's like 60,000 young people being like, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." And we were talking about it afterwards, and we were like, man, growing up, it was like, don't come yet. I want to get married. I'm scared. Please don't come. I'm not ready. I'm going to go to hell. And like, but the perspective we should have is like, oh my gosh, please come. I want to see you. I want to go home to heaven. Like, it's actually going to be the most exciting, most incredible day of our lives instead of the most terrifying. Which is crazy.
And that point too of like, I want to get married, I want this, that, and this, like, that Jesus wants that for you too. And like, it's not wrong to want those things. And I remember like in certain environments being feel ashamed for the fact that I wanted that to happen before Jesus came. Like, it meant something about like my relationship with God, or like how I wasn't like a true believer, or how dare I want to experience these things on earth when Jesus has something better for me in heaven. And it's like, that's just so crazy that like you're made to feel like something's wrong with you for wanting things that God created you to have. Like,
and that like he's gonna whatever heaven looks like, he's got our happiness in mind. It's gonna be something so beautiful. So it's just been like a mind-blowing experience, and I talk in circles about it all the time. I've talked to my college roommate about it. My college roommate. That's so cool. So we've been talking about it, and it's been a journey. And it's just been so cool to like talk about it with people that understand you, because that was one thing that Zach has told me. He's like, I've been telling you these things forever, and like you never listened to me. And I was like, you don't understand. Like, in order to come out of that, you have to hear it from somebody who's been through it, who's been in it.
You can't, like, we're literally programmed to not listen to outsiders. Like,
yep,
you
100%.
and I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
impossible for somebody to come out of it from like an outsider's perspective, but like for me, it had to come from somebody who knew my
Well, for
experience.
me, the person who sent me the former Adventist podcast was a friend of mine who had been Adventist growing up. And yeah, I probably
Mm,
wouldn't have taken it from a non Adventist because I'd be like, oh, well, you don't actually know. But
yeah.
that kind of, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, like, how has this changed your relationship with Zach? And then, like, how has it changed your mental health? Because
Yeah.
those things seem like they're very different than before.
Oh, for sure. I would say my relationship with Zach's been like a 180 in so many different aspects. Number one, like
Mm.
we are on the same page, like the same
Mm.
page. He is so much more open to discussions about spirituality, whereas before, because of the way I approached him, he just wouldn't
Yeah.
tell me what he thought because I just
Understandably.
was so, yeah, like I can't believe he ever put up with that. Like, but he did. And I
Because
remember
he could see that you love Jesus, and
yeah,
so he probably understood that, like, he could probably see it from a deeper perspective.
right.
But yeah, it's
Yeah.
a miracle that God led you guys through that, because so many
Yeah,
couples break up over it, and
for
I
sure.
understand why. I would have done the same thing. Um, but how sad. I've seen friends break up with genuinely really godly people because of that feeling that they have to be Adventist,
Mhm.
and then later
Mhm.
those people end up leaving Adventism, and it's like, what if, like, I mean, I don't want to say what if
Yeah.
that was their person, because I know God has, like, a lot
Right.
of people, but, like, what if that was something beautiful they missed out on
Yeah.
because of that conditioning that we have, and that's just so sad.
Yeah. And I remember asking him too, like after, like it's been probably 3 months. It's been a 9 month journey for me now because it started, I guess,
Yeah.
in May. But
Yeah.
3 months in, I remember like I was on the phone with him, and I had actually just come back from getting my hair done, and I get my hair done in Greenville, which is where I'm from, and my hairstylist
Mm-hmm.
used to go to my church, and she also is a former Adventist, and so I was like talking to her about
Oh.
everything. Yeah, it's so interesting. So I was talking to her about everything, and I knew that she was before I was questioning it because she told me like, oh yeah, like I'm not Adventist anymore. I don't believe in that investigative judgment. And I was like, I didn't even remember what that was, but I was just like, oh okay, like I just brushed it off.
Yeah.
But I remember after all of this, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to talk to Brenda. Like, I need to hear from her. And so I went and got my hair done over the summer, and I was on the phone with Zach, and I was like, you'll like, just, I can't believe all these things I used to believe. I was like, did you ever, like, pray that I would come out of this? And he was like, yeah, but I also knew you would. I was like, how? He's like, I don't know. I just had a feeling. I was like,
Because he could trust
okay.
your relationship with God. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was sweet. But I think one of the biggest ways, I mean, of course, like, we're going to church together now, which, like, we hadn't done. And that's beautiful and
Yeah.
wonderful in its own way. But, like, we're praying together. It's not something that I, like, shy away from subconsciously because I don't want to ruffle feathers.
Yeah.
Not only that, but, like, having this confidence that we're on the same page when it comes to, like, our future with kids, like, that's so wonderful for me because that was a huge
Huge.
sore spot of, like, anxiety and all kinds of things, and I don't have this fear that he's, like, not meant for me, like, because I've always, and that's something, like, when you know that saying, like, but genuinely, like, God gave
It's
me
actually
this
true.
man, like, he gave me this man, so,
Yeah.
like, not having that opposing of, like, but what if he didn't, but, like, what if, like,
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
so nice, but I would say the biggest way, specifically for me, has been the way I relate and treat him, so, like, hearing that episode about, like, freedom from offense, it's not that I, like, was a horribly mean girlfriend or whatever, but I think that the way I approach conflict now is so much different than I used to.
Yeah.
And that has absolutely changed my life and changed our relationship. Like
Yeah.
the other day when we were with my friend Madison and her husband, who I'd recently shown your episodes to, they were like, well, so what do you think? Like, how has this changed her? And he was like, well, first of all, she's way less anxious. And second of all, like, there's a lot more, like, room for grace. I feel like things are approached in a different way, and I'm definitely a more critical person in nature. I don't think, like, anytime I ask him if there's a way I can be a better girlfriend to him, he's like, you're fine, like, you're perfect, I can't think of anything. And I'm like, that's such a lie,
Yeah.
but, like, I ask him frequently, but I feel like I was always, like, harping on him and, like, telling him. And so, like, when I approach it from a different aspect of, like, not necessarily, like, for sure respecting certain boundaries and, like, talking about things that
Right.
need to be talked about, but, like, and I think this also is informed by trauma I've experienced, but, like, I used to hold it in such a different light, and it would take me down, like, this dark pattern of thoughts, like, abandonment issue thoughts, like anxious attachment style thoughts. And so like now that I'm
Yep.
grounded in like my understanding of like the gospel and what that means for me, what that means for him, and what that means for our love for each other, that is so much harder for my brain to go down. I'm not saying I don't experience those things sometimes, but it's a lot
Yeah.
easier to climb out of it than it used to be. Like I never even had a tool to navigate that.
It's transformational. Like I feel like
Literally.
it's the biggest thing, and we didn't necessarily have the experience before because we met right after God had like done this shift in our lives, so we went
Mhm.
into our relationship with that perspective. But I
Right.
know from like previous, like, not necessarily relationships, but even just how I interacted with friends, it's
Yeah.
so different.
So
And
different.
it makes
Yeah.
marriage, like all the advice, most of the advice you hear about marriage, honestly, is not really applicable once you understand the freedom from offense. It
Yes.
doesn't have to be all that stuff, because if they do
No.
something that rubs you the wrong way, you can let it go. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you can talk about it, but it doesn't have to
Right.
be this whole like, I'm giving you the silent treatment and like all this stuff.
Yeah.
It's so different. So
It is
different.
so different, and it's literal freedom, and it's what God meant for us to have, and that's
Yeah.
just like it's just so wonderful. But I would say like with my mental health, I am still on my medication. I kind of take it intermittently here and there, which is kind of bad because you're supposed to take it consistently. But I've been
I
off
feel
of
you.
work
Honestly, I do the
for
exact
like
same thing. It's probably not good.
yeah, I've been off of work for this last month, and I actually haven't taken it consistently for two reasons. One, during contracts, if you're not employed, you don't have insurance. So I knew that I wouldn't get a refill before, but also because I've been feeling pretty good. I still think that it's something I can use as a tool to help me, especially when I work night shift. It just messes with my
Yeah.
like hormones in my
Totally.
brain. But I have noticed that like the constant state of anxiety is definitely gone, but also like I want to be careful how I say this because you can definitely have a deep relationship with Christ and understand what he's done for you and still experience depression and anxiety. And I know that firsthand, but I
Yeah.
do
Same.
feel that this transformation is going to make it a lot harder for me to go down those paths.
Yes.
And that's just like in understanding the weight of how my entire life has been transformed by this. And just my entire worldview is changed. And so I still am a person, I still experience emotions, and that's okay. But like recognizing, like you guys say, like feelings are not like Lord Jesus is. Like having that to ground me is like so transformative in all aspects. Like for instance, at work, I sometimes my patients can be very rude and they can treat me horribly. And usually I don't take offense to that. I mean, you're in the hospital, you're having a bad day, but sometimes people really cross the line. And so one of the things I hold on to is like, all right, Lord, I'm feeling angry right now, but you've given me the tools to be kind, compassionate, and loving, and I can still establish boundaries with this patient and be respectful. But because of what you've given me, this has nothing to do with my character, and I can show your love and your grace to them. And what's so interesting is I had a patient, and this was about a little bit after I had heard like the episode about freedom from offense, and she was very, very weird lady. She was very entitled. She was very hard to please. And I remember before I would go into her room, I'd be like, Lord, no part of me right now wants to be nice to her, but you have given me the ability to do so. And so I'm going to hold on to that. And so I wasn't rude at all, I don't think, but I didn't think I was my cheery, bubbly, loving like self that I normally am. And so a week after that, my manager came up to me and she was like, hey, do you remember the patient that was in room 22? And I was like, yeah. She was like, she said you were the only nurse that knew what she was doing and you're the only one that cared about her and that you were the best one she'd ever had. And I was like, really? I was like, are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure. I was like, and I said to my manager, I said, you know, Barb, that's the Lord. She's like, honey, won't he do it? I was like, yes, he will, because that was not me. Like, so
that's the Spirit living in you.
Literally. And even when I don't feel like it's coming out of me, it still is. Like, even if I can't see it, it's still there. So that has been super awesome. And just like, I don't know, like you can't help but feel joy understanding the gospel and how that transforms your life and what it means for every other aspect. Like I just can't help but have a joyous spirit. And like when I do have the feelings, I experience the feeling of anxiety, experience the feeling of sadness, it doesn't last nearly as long as it used to. And I feel like I have this guide that I can turn to that I didn't necessarily have before. And I, like I said, want to be very careful about how I say that, because as somebody who's experienced mental health and mental health struggles and knows that they're very tangible and real, even in the presence of God, I don't want to like negate any kind of experience that other people have, or something I may have in the future that haven't come across. But I will say that, like, overall, my state of mind, I have so much more peace. I have so much more joy. I understand the peace of the Lord that surpasses all understanding. Like, I used to look at that verse and love it and claim it, but I've never understood its truth and claimed it before in my life like I have now. It's just like this beautiful thing. And I'm so grateful for it. And I cannot tell you enough how much, like, you guys have transformed my life, and you've been that catalyst. And like, the Lord has used you. Like, if you hadn't touched anyone else's life, like, you've touched mine, and I'm sure you have. But and I've just been sharing it with everyone I know, especially within Adventist circles. And like, you're transforming more lives, and you're going to transform generations. And like, the Lord is using you in such a powerful way within the community we have come out of, but also in other ways. I mean, you make episodes that have nothing to do with Adventism that are wonderful and beautiful, and people struggle with understanding the gospel outside of Adventism as well. So there's just so many avenues that you can reach, and I'm just so grateful that our paths have crossed. And just, I love seeing your life and how much you've been transformed. I mean, I knew you when you were coming out of your conservatism, like at the beginning.
Barely. You knew me when I had left 2 weeks before I met you. I had left home. So
but
I
even
was
throughout that year, like, I'd seen it happening.
It's
and
true.
So, like,
you probably saw it happening, yeah.
I remember once that I walked into your apartment and you were watching Crazy Rich Asians on your laptop, and you closed your laptop so fast. And I was like, Hannah, what are you
Well, because
doing?
you guys weren't allowed to watch that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I tried to, like, respect the rules around you guys and not let you know the areas, like, where I didn't agree, which I got very lax on that in the rest of the time that I was there. But I was still being really trying to be the good girl, and I remember that. I was like, oh, no, I'm going to be in so much trouble.
But I just thought it was so funny. I was like, I love that for her. Like, and I remember, too, like, being in your car and you would listen to like worship music with drums in it, I'd be like, oh, thank God. Like, like that was one
of my other ways that I got around it. On campus, I wouldn't play it because it was against campus rules, but when I was off campus, and it was my personal vehicle, I was like, well, you know.
Yeah, and that's the thing, too, is, like, I believe I went to that academy for a reason. Obviously, like, you were part of that story. But reflecting, especially coming out of this, reflecting on the things that are implemented there and, like, literally burned into your brain there, like, even though I felt like I was definitely more of, like, a liberal Christian in that environment, I feel like a lot of the students were on the same page. We just kind of sat through all of that because we had to. Even that being said, I did come out of that experience with a lot more legalism than I went into with it, even if it was subconscious. And so having to undo a lot of that has been very interesting, having to undo a lot of the teachings, especially specifically like the purity culture, and like that was so bad. I don't know if I ever told you the story about one time. So this is when the dress code, it wasn't written in the dress code, but on the dress code, we were told we had to cover our bottom half with like a t-shirt or flannel.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was so thankful when you came and you were like, that's not in the dress code. I'm not implementing that, because I was like, I can be a woman. Like, I can look like a woman and not a hobo. That's awesome. Love that.
I know.
And so I'll never forget, we were in a worship service in the dean's apartment, and they were talking about purity and like dress code, and talking about how leggings were like horrible and like why would you even want to wear them. And they were like, they took a moment during this and they said, there's somebody in this room that we just want to thank so much for just following the dress code and going above and beyond. And then they said my name and made everyone clap for me. And I literally, like, the only reason I followed the dress code is because I hated feeling like I was the whore of Babylon. Like,
you were good at keeping the rules.
That's how they made me feel. Like, I was like, I don't want to go through this. I don't want to experience this. I don't want to be felt like I am the problem. So I was going on my way, because every time somebody greeted me, it would be, hi, Lexie, and they would be staring at my bottom half. Like, they wouldn't be looking in my eyes. And the first day I went there, like, so I had worked all summer long at a job and got money to help pay for my tuition, but also I needed, like, help paying for clothes. And So I went out of my way to find clothes that I felt were suitable for this school, things I wouldn't normally wear, but, went out of my way, spent hard-earned money that could have gone to my tuition, but I needed clothes for it. And the first day I was there, the dean sat me down in my room and said, "Do you have any shirts that are longer than the ones you have now?" And I was like, "No, I got these. I thought they were, She was like, "Well, could you buy some?" I said, "No, my family doesn't have money. Like, I spent my hard-earned money on this." And then I start crying. And then she's like, "It's okay. I'll get you some stuff from Goodwill." And she gets me, like, these 3X, 2XL shirts. And I'll never forget that. That was, like, my first day there. I was like,
that's so traumatizing.
My gosh.
And that wasn't in the handbook. And that's why when I got there, I was like, if I already didn't want to implement so much of that, but I understood if it was in the handbook, I made a decision to do it. But I was like, if it's not in there, I am not doing it. Like,
and
it's just so hard that you had to go through that, and like the way that makes you feel as a woman.
Yeah,
is, like,
and
not
so
great.
like afterwards, I would say like I didn't like comparative to like society's standards of promiscuous. It's not really promiscuous, but compared to like the environment I was in, I was like, I went out of my way to like express myself in that way
do the opposite,
because of how much I had been like as soon as I graduated, I dyed my hair black. Like, I was
honestly, girl, everybody did the same thing. When people would come back for grad, it was like everybody was doing it. And I remember thinking, wow, and I already knew something was wrong, but I'm like, something is wrong that people are leaving this school, and not the dress part, but like actually becoming atheists. Like, this is a problem.
A lot of people do. Yeah.
And it's because it's not the true freedom that God, not necessarily just that school, but just, in general, there's so much that is not the true freedom that is in God's word, and it's a man-made thing, and it's no wonder that people don't want any part in it.
Yeah, and it just makes me sad for, like, that's why I'm so passionate about it, because of the amount of people that are still in it, especially, like, the youth, like, I mean, I'm still a youth, but, like, like high school, middle school, like, being in those environments, and especially not being shown how to have a relationship with Jesus, it's almost a recipe for disaster. Like,
it is a recipe for disaster.
Well, yeah. And so, like, that's part of the reason I have so much of, like, a passion for it, is, like, not just for those that I know, but, like, those that are still in it, like, future generations of, like, my friend that's married. I mean, well, she's not having kids, but my other friends that are married, and they're pregnant, like, just stopping all of this horrible, incorrect things about the one who created us, and like living in truth and changing lives around us is just so important. And I just 9 months in, and I just can't shut up about it, and I don't think I ever will be able to. So it's been an awesome journey.
I love it. This has been such an encouraging episode, honestly, because we actually, between season 1 and 2, we were like, do we quit? Like, because, in general, most of the feedback has been very, very negative. And, we've lost a lot of friendships, and, maybe not like super close friendships, but people that we thought we were friends with. And it's like, oh, wow, apparently not when you read the comments.
Yeah.
And it's like, we've had conversations where we're like, has any good really actually come from doing this? Like, or we just like, we felt like God was asking us to do it, but like, has it actually done anything other than like get people to hate us? But this is really encouraging to hear that, like,
Good.
You know what, even if we just did the podcast for you, it's so worth it. Like, I'll keep doing it. Like, I can't wait for Ian to listen to this episode, because I think it will really encourage him too.
Yeah.
And not because there's anything special about us. It's really the truth of God's word. When you put it out there, it's amazing. It sheds light. Like, God's word is really alive.
Yeah.
And I think it's so cool that, maybe in some way we're able to share that, and that, the power of God's word, if more people can see that, like, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just me you've affected. I mean, I've shared your podcast with so many people I can't even count. Like, and even like my mom, for instance, like born and raised Adventist, and I was wondering
how that's been for her. Yeah.
Yeah. So in her adult years, she actually turned away from God to the point where she didn't believe he cared about her. And she's had a very hard life, but that was really hard for me, because I was like, I'm not going to see my mom in heaven. Like, what? And so, to the point where I couldn't talk to her about it, because I would get so mad. Out of my love for her, but it just wouldn't come across in a good way. And so when I started going through all of this, like, she was like, that's what I've always believed God to be. Like, that's what I've always thought. And so, like, I've shared episodes with her. I shared the paper Ian wrote, and she's speaking about God in a way that she believes in him, and believes who he is and what
Oh
he
my
can give,
gosh.
and, like, in the truth. And I have so much more, like, oh my gosh, like, my mom doesn't feel abandoned by God anymore. And a lot of it had to do with
Wow.
the way that the Adventist church raised her and influenced her parents. And, like, she was always taught by her mother, who was fifth generation Adventist, that your parents are a representation of God on earth for you. And she's had a very complicated relationship with her
That's an
mother.
Ellen
And
White thing, actually.
yeah. And so, like, that informed her view of God. And she was like, well, if God's like my mom, I don't want him. Like, and that's gotten, like, worse throughout her adulthood. Well, it had. And so, like, it's transformed her life. And the peace I have in knowing, like, my mother feels the love of the Father and is on a journey that's leading her back to where she always belonged. And how she's like, Lexie, like, I experienced all of these things in my 20s. I just didn't have any other information beyond what I knew. And I thought I could be my own kind of Adventist, and it led her down this path that ended up leading her out of believing in God. So
Wow.
it's wonderful that I've gotten to see that and see her be excited and on fire for the things she always knew God to be in her life. But the Adventist worldview just did not enable him to grow in what she knew, because you can't have both. You just can't.
That is so crazy. That's so beautiful. It reminds me, I remember my second or third year at the academy, I got really discouraged with, what I was doing, because I felt like every kid that I would pour into would end up, like, not believing in God anymore after they left. And I was like, not what's the point, but I was like something's not working. Like, and now I look back and I understand that, like, even though it's not what I believed, but, like, when you're being fed with so much that's not actually the true gospel and so many distortions of the view of God, it's no surprise that so many young people are leaving, or not even just young people, that so many adults are like, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. And that's why from the very beginning I've had a passion to share this podcast, was not to create controversy, but because I've seen, people that I love become atheists because of misunderstandings about God. And it's like, but that's not even who God is. But I understand why they think that, because that's all they've ever heard. And maybe if they could hear who God really is, they would realize, like, oh my gosh, I don't actually have to be an atheist. And it's just sad that there's so much misunderstanding.
That's one of the things too that's been interesting to hear, like, with the former Adventist podcast, is they're like, there's an Adventist God and there's the Christian God, and I don't believe in the Adventist God. And so that's the thing too, is if you're raised in that environment where you're told over and over, this is truth, this is truth, this is truth, and that's what you accept, and you don't want to believe that, then you go to, all you can think of is atheism, because you're like, well, if that's truth, I don't want it. Like you said, like,
I understand why so many of my peers became atheist. It makes sense.
And it's so sad, because it's like, he's right there. The God you search for, you desire, you're longing for, he is right there. Yeah. And it's just, it's horrible. Like, I always say that, like, Satan works like a sheep and like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so, like, as this may be triggering for some people, but, like, he uses the Seventh-day Adventist denomination and other things too as the wolf in sheep's clothing. Like, he presents it to be this beautiful community, this wonderful thing, and there are good things that can come from it, but he's literally doing what he wants to do. He's twisting and he's manipulating, and he is giving you the exact opposite of what Jesus wants you to understand. And it's only
and the fact that there's good things makes it even more confusing. Because there are genuinely beautiful parts of it.
Yeah, and it's just hard to grapple with it. And I didn't even realize how much of my identity was entrenched in some Adventism. Like, I felt like I was having an identity crisis, and I'm like, "What? I'm a bad Adventist. Why is this a problem for me?" But it was, and, like, associating with something for that long, like, it was just a core of who you are, and like, entrenches every aspect of your life. And it's when you take a step back and look, like, all right, if you're born into an Adventist family, you go to Adventist school, you go to Adventist churches, you're surrounded by Adventist people, you go to Adventist universities, and then some people even only work in Adventist environments. Tell me how that's not a cult. Like, tell me how that's not a cult. Well, and
at the end of the day, like, our identity should only be in Jesus. And whether it's a religion or, like, in this season for me, it's like the temptation to have motherhood become my identity is very strong, let me tell you, because it consumes 24/7. But our identity isn't in anything but Jesus. And then when it becomes in a religion, it's so dangerous, and it all gets tied up in the emotional attachment, and that's why it's so hard to leave, and the cult part and the manipulation, and it's so dangerous.
Yeah, and it's definitely like it'd be interesting to look into like the psychology behind it all, of like how it really affects the brain, because I mean it is traumatic, and I used to think I didn't have like church hurt or like church trauma, but coming out of it I'm like, oh wait, I did.
Yeah.
Like, that's crazy. But
once you're ready to dig even more into it, Answering Adventism, that YouTube channel, it digs in really deep. At first, it can be a lot to handle because it's so, he digs in so deep, like with all the proof text, all the stuff from the fundamental beliefs or from Ellen White, and it can be really intense at first, but it does also help you recognize a lot of stuff that's like, oh, wow, there's a lot to this.
Yeah,
but
and that's definitely
anyway,
where I'm at
I don't want to drag this on too long, but thank you so much for coming on here.
Yeah.
This has to be one of my favorite episodes, honestly, so far.
Well,
so thank you so much for sharing. Me too, and I'm glad that it took a little longer because it just gave even more time for God to keep working in your life that you can share. So thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited for people to listen to this episode and just to really hopefully just grasp that like the gospel really is better than you thought. That's really
better than you thought. It's the best name you could have come up with. Better than you thought.
Yeah, God had his hand in that one, because I don't even think we hadn't left Adventism yet when we actually came up with this podcast. But we knew a lot of our views were not going to be accepted within Adventism, and because we were working for the church, we were trying to figure out how to launch the podcast without, causing tension and controversy. And thank God we didn't actually end up launching until after we had left Adventism and we could just speak freely, which I think was a good thing, because we would have been constantly beating around the bush and trying to figure out how to say it politically correctly. And so I think God had his hand in that. But yeah, the gospel really is better than we thought, and the truth really does set us free.
For real. Yeah.
Thanks so much, girl. I'm so happy you came on, and so excited to launch this episode.
Yeah, me too. And I'll have to come visit y'all in Montana sometime. I've always wanted to go up there.
Yes.
Actually, why I went to Canada.
You should.
I was originally going to go to Montana, but then I realized Canada was cheaper to go to, and I was like, oh, okay.
And depending on the time of year, the really cool places here are only open in the summer. So
I wanted to go to Glacier really bad, but I will end up heading that way, and I'll let you know.
Next summer, come see us.
Yeah, I will. All right, thank you so much,
Thank
Hannah.
you so much.
Bye.